This is part 2 of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment video, and there are 3 parts. And these 54th Massachusetts Regiment videos are some of the most important videos on this channel, but begin with part 1 and watch them in order. All right, this is part 2 of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment video. This part 2, I wanted to put it into 2 parts because there's so much more, and it's equally important, but it's a kind of a different tangent, but on the same theme. It's the same story. It's all God's big picture. It's all interconnected. But this particular part is also very closely the same story as the one in part 1. It's in essence, if you will, a continuation of part 1, but we start from a different angle, which is the signs that occurred on March 11th, 2023. And so this is a different email thread. And to tell this story, which is part of the same Massachusetts 54th Regiment story, and part 1 only just at the end of it started talking about or telling this story. So there's much more to be told about this 54th Massachusetts Regiment story, which we will get into in this email thread. Now, the first thing to be said here is that the reason why this is highlighted is for no reason other than to find this email. I did a search for it, typing in 3 and 11 because of the date 3/11, and I can't get rid of this highlight at this moment because my internet connection is down. So never mind the highlight, but it is very important. And let's see, to give you a background, because I don't in this email, because who I am writing to, my friends, already know the significance of the date 3/11. God, in his big picture of signs, has been overwhelmingly demonstrated that combinations of 3 and 11 are hinting at or symbolizing a few different things. Specifically, and also there has been serious emphasis on dates with 3/11 in it. For example, COVID Day, the day that the World Health Organization officially declared coronavirus to be a pandemic, which, by the way, was predicted ahead of time. I had been predicting that something very big and bad would occur on that date, and I was not saying anything like that about any other date in 2020. And also in retrospect, I should have been able to know that I could have known that it would be a virus, but I didn't know what to expect ahead of time. But anyway, March 11, 2023 was the day that the World Health Organization officially declared coronavirus to be a pandemic. It was the symbolic day of the beginning of the pandemic. And also on that day, President Trump gave a prophetic Oval Office speech, and it was his coronavirus address. And there were many other prophetic signs on that date, which is explained in other videos. The reason why I go into that is because I'm just giving you a second witness confirmation for why this date, 3/11, is important. Now, the few of the reasons for why 3/11 is important is because God is pointing to Revelation 3:11. In Revelation chapter 3, God, Jesus, has written letters to 7 churches, and the passage of Revelation 3:11 is a verse in the letter written to the Church of Philadelphia, the only church out of the 7 that Jesus said would be spared the hour of tribulation. In other words, would be raptured. This is Revelation 3:11. It says, Jesus saying, "Behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown." This verse is preceded by verse 10. "Because you have kept my command to persevere, I will also keep you from the hour of trial, which shall come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. Behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown." So Jesus is warning here that he's coming soon, and he's warning his Church of Philadelphia to hold their crown, stay steadfast, and you will be removed before the hour or from the hour of tribulation. In other words, raptured. So this is very important. Now, another reason why God uses the combinations of 3 and 11 is because he's pointing to the two words in Strong's Concordance. The 131st word in Strong's Greek Concordance, which is the word for blood disease. And that's related to the blood disease that people get after having taken the mark of the Antichrist, the thing. And also Greek, Strong's Greek 8G 113. Again, another combination of 2 11s and a 3. Strong's Greek New Testament Concordance G 113 is the word for lawless, unprincipled men. And that's obviously hinting at the reason for God's judgment, which will follow the rapture. Well, it's unfolding now, but that's the reason for all of what is happening. So let's begin with the signs that I'm talking about that occurred on March 11th. On the date 3/11, the Boston Bruins became the first team to ever reach 50 wins in their first 64 games of the season. It was the quickest reach of 50 wins in history. So here at this time that I wrote this, which by the way, as we can see here, was March 11th. So this was long before April 13th. This was the first sign in which it became aware that God is using the Boston Bruins in this particular season as a major prophetic sign. So this is, again, this story that I'm about to tell will unfold and build on itself and reach a climax. In other words, it's like a movie. The plot continually increases and builds as we go. And so I'm just beginning with this particular sign that occurred on March 11th, which was the first inclination that God was using the Boston Bruins, because they became the first team to reach 50 wins in their first 64 games, the quickest ever in history to reach 50 wins in a season. And again, as I explained in part 1, it was all about the season of the Boston Bruins. Remember how I explained how they broke the record for most wins in a season, and their season came down to the last game of the season, the prophetic sign on Montreal Island. Okay, so this was another season prophetic sign, because in this season became the first team to reach 50 games in the shortest amount of games, 50 wins. Their 50th win was against the Red Wings. Now, the reason why 50 wins is prophetic is because the number 50 symbolizes the church. And so does Boston. Boston is the spiritual location of the spiritual founding of America. And that's why God uses Boston. For that matter, the Boston Bruins play their hockey games in an arena at the mouth of the Charles River, which is where John Winthrop, with his flotilla, arrived in 1630 and founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Boston. And so anyway, the number 50 symbolizes the church because the Feast of Pentecost symbolizes the church, and Pentecost literally means 50th. And so this was their 50th win, and it was Boston Bruins. This is in itself clear indication that this is a prophetic sign from God, because God also uses records in his signs to highlight and confirm his signs. This was the all-time record quickest reach of 50 wins, but it wasn't just any season. It's right now, the end times, but it was Boston. All right, so let's continue. Their 50th win was against the Red Wings, okay? 9 + 9 + 9 years ago was when the Red Wings won 50 games in 66 games, okay? So the Bruins won their first 50 games in 64 games, 9 + 9 + 9 years ago, which is symbolism for God's judgment, an emphasis of the number 9, which symbolizes judgment. 9 + 9 + 9 years ago was when the Red Wings, the team that the Boston Bruins just happened to be playing, coincidentally, won their 50 games in 66 games. Okay? Now, 23 years later, the Lightning won 50 games in 66 games. This is a pairing of 9 and 23. Okay, and as I explained earlier, God pairs 9 and 23 together to confirm the signs and connections and to reveal the identity of the Antichrist, who wore jersey number 23 when he played basketball in high school and became president in 2009. Also, as was explained, Barack Obama in Hebrew means lightning from heaven. Barack is the word for lightning. And it was the Tampa Bay Lightning hockey team that 23 years prior to the Bruins winning 50 games in 64 games, the Lightning won 50 games in 66 games. So we have these two teams that won their first 50 games in 66 games. That was the previous record. And the two teams that had this previous record hint at 9 and 23. The Antichrist is described in the 66th book of the Bible, and his number is 666. So, more confirmation. The Tampa Bay Lightning, Antichrist, and the Antichrist is in the 66th book in the Bible, and 666 is his number, and that's described in that book, the 66th book. That's why these two other teams that won 50 games, which hints at the church, which will be persecuted by the Antichrist, won their 50 games in 66 games. Okay, those that will be raptured from the persecution of the Antichrist will fly. It is said in Bible prophecy that they will meet the Lord in the clouds. This is the reason for the red wings in this sign. Red wings hints at flight and flying. Okay, so it is also the reason for the Bruins in this sign, as the most famous goal in history was the flying goal by Bruins player Bobby Orr. This was in the 1970 Stanley Cup when the Boston Bruins won in overtime, and I explain more of that in a second. Anyway, it was the flying goal. It's the most famous hockey goal in all of history, and also the photograph of the flying goal is arguably the most famous photograph in all of sports history. Because Bobby Orr, player number 4 in Game 4, was scored the winning goal in the fourth period, overtime, 40 seconds into the overtime, to win the series 4-0. And after he scored the winning goal, he was tripped by St. Louis player number 4 and then flew into the air. And his flight became known as the flying goal. I'll show a picture when I produce this video. You'll see this flying goal, most iconic, one of the most iconic sports photos in all of history. The number that symbolizes the raptured is 144 in Bible prophecy, 144,000. Here is something truly amazing. I was inspired to read Exodus recently, the book of Exodus in the Bible, and a few days ago, I did a search on the discrepancy between 400 and 430 years in Egypt, because there's a discrepancy in the Bible regarding this, but it's not a contradiction. I came across this article that includes a timeline between Abraham and Exodus. All right. I found it remarkable that there were 64 years in between Joseph's death and Moses' birth. It was because I learned this that just a couple of days ago, that it was still fresh in my mind. After reading this story about the Bruins' feat of 50 wins in 64 games, I recalled this number, 64, is in the timeline. Joseph was a type for Jesus. Although the brothers didn't know it at the time, he was sacrificed to go down to Egypt. Egypt is symbolic of the world and sin. Joseph died in Egypt. Jesus was killed by Satan. Pharaoh in Egypt is symbolic of Satan. Joseph died at 110. 110 is symbolic of Jesus' first coming on Nisan 10, the 10th day of the first of the month, and then his death. Joshua, who is also a type for Jesus, died at 110, and he led the Hebrews into the promised land on the date 110, which was symbolism for Jesus leading his followers to the promised land through his death and resurrection, which is why they both occurred, these symbolic crossings or entry. This is the triumphal entry, and this is the crossing into the promised land on the date 110. And by the way, these two 110s are the reason why two 110-story towers collapsed on 9/11. One reason. This is symbolic of the rapture, the Hebrews taking the promised land. Moses is also a type for Jesus. Moses delivered the Hebrews from Egypt. From Joseph's death at 110, it is 144 years to Moses' deliverance of the Hebrews in the Exodus. And again, as I said, 144 is symbolism in the book of Revelation for those that will be raptured and raptured to the promised land. The reason for going into this in this email is because we can now see the significance of 64. 64 also hints at 6 times 4 equals 24. 2024 is the year of Jesus' second coming and the deliverance of the raptured into the promised land. What proves this 64 games hints at exactly what I have just explained is that 64 days from this 50 wins in 64 games on March 11th is May 14th, the 75th anniversary of Israel. 64 days is also 2 months and 3 days, which is a number 23, which is the number of the Antichrist. 75 years is 900 months. This is a pairing of 9 and 23 that confirms the signs and connections. May 14th is 514, which hints at 5 times 14 equals 70. Jesus' fig tree prophecy in Matthew 24 informs us that his second coming would be within a generation of May 14th, 1948, because this was the rebirth of Israel in the spring of 1948. And in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the fig tree is symbolism for Israel. And Jesus said in the prophecy, in the parable, that when the fig tree would put forth its leaves, a generation would not pass from that time until the time of the end, the end times. And anyway, Psalm 90:10 tells us that a generation is 70 to 80 years. And this is one reason why Israel was reborn on the date May 14th, because it hints at the number 70. The mean of 70 and 80 years is 75 years. 75 years is 900 months, and the number 9 is the number that symbolizes God's judgment. A few days after the 75th anniversary, it is predicted that Israel will nuke Iran and then Damascus. Or rather, it is predicted that Israel will bomb Iran and then nuke Damascus. It could be that Israel will use nukes on Iran as well. But this will be right after the 900th month anniversary of the rebirth of Israel, which is extremely prophetic. And this May 14th date, this 70th anniversary, is 64 days after the Bruins won their 50th game in 64 games. So, and 64 days, again, hints at the exodus from Israel because of the 64 years in the timeline that I mentioned. The news story highlights how the Bruins came back from a 2-goal deficit. A 2-goal deficit hints at the second coming. The Bruins scored 2 goals in the second period. The second period also hints at the second coming. The Bruins scored 2 goals to tie the game, and these 2 goals came within 30, which made the score 2-2, and these 2 goals came within 88 seconds. This is the story of this. This is the news story. This is the story of this game. These goals were scored by players set 37 and 27. I just want to emphasize that one more time. This is how God does it. This is the big highlight, if you will, in the news story, was how the two goals that tied the game in the second period came within a remarkable 88 seconds, which is a relatively short period of time. These goals were scored by players 37 and 27, their jersey numbers. 37 plus 27 equals 64. Okay, and again, this is about how the Bruins won their first 50 games in a record 64 games. Okay, 88 seconds hints at 8 times 8 equals 64. The two goals, again, were scored 88 seconds apart, and 8 times 8 equals 64. And the jersey numbers add up to 64, and it was their 50th win in 64 games, a record. This was the day that the Bruins won their 50th game in 64 games played and broke the NHL record. So that's amazing confirmation of all of the prophetic significance of this game. The NHL was founded in 1917. The year of the Balfour Declaration was founded, that founded Israel. Okay, let me repeat that. I apologize. The NHL was founded in 1917. Which was the same year of the Balfour Declaration, which is the famous British declaration that declared Israel be a homeland, the Palestine be a homeland for the Jewish people, officially, legally allowing Jews to emigrate to Israel. This was the significant event in the founding of Israel. 1917. It just so happens that the NHL was founded in this same year. In fact, in the same month of 1917. Okay? There were originally 6 teams until the NHL expanded in 1967. Okay? Throughout the NHL history, there was only 6 teams, for which Boston was one of them. And not coincidentally, so were the Detroit Red Wings, the other team in this prophetic game. These 2 teams, in other words, were 2 of the original 6 teams, which is by God's design, until the NHL expanded in 1967, with 6 more teams, actually. 1967 was also the year that Israel expanded its territory in the 6-Day War. The original 6 teams hint at the 6-Day War. In fact, they expanded with 6 more teams in the same year of the 6-Day War. And so we have the NHL, in other words, paralleling, the history of the NHL paralleling Israel. The Bruins and the Red Wings were 2 of the original 6 teams. And so they were playing each other in this prophetic game, which again was 64 days before the prophetic 70th anniversary. And we have these 2 original 6 teams playing each other in this prophetic game that points to it. So again, the 50 wins in 64 games hints at adding 64 days to the anniversary of Israel. And in the game, we have confirmation for the 64 with the 2 goals scored 88 seconds, which hints at 8 times 8 and equals 64. And the jersey numbers of the 2 players that scored the 2 goals hints at 64. And when were they scored? These 2 goals to tie the game at 2-2 in the second period, which hints at the second coming of Lord Jesus Christ after he was crucified in Israel by the Jews that had rejected him. And the reason why they are Jews being restored to Israel is for the purpose of finishing history, because Jesus said he wouldn't return until, 1, the gospel had gone around the world, and now it has. Even remote tribes in the Amazon have heard the gospel. And 2, when the Jews would call upon him by his name. And that's what they will do at the climax of all of history, when the armies of the enemies of Israel are amassed on its border and in Israel, ready to destroy Jerusalem, and they cry out for Jesus to save them, as recorded in Zechariah chapter 12. And that's when the Jews weep for the one that they had crucified, as it says in Zechariah chapter 12, which was written 700 years before Jesus, the Old Testament. But it says that the Jews will cry for the one that they have pierced. And that's what it says. And of course, Jesus was pierced. He was crucified by them, the Jews that had rejected him. In other words, God is pointing to all of this through this prophetic game, that it was 64 days before the prophetic 75th anniversary of Israel, the 900th month anniversary of Israel. And 75 is the mean between 70 and 80, described and mentioned in Psalm 90:10, that says that a generation is 70 or 80 years. And Jesus said that his return in the end times would occur within a generation of the creation of Israel, which was on May 14th, 1978. So I think this is all clear. Hopefully you got this. This is huge. This 50th win hints at the church, and the number 50 symbolizes the church. The church will be rescued by Jesus. The name Jesus in Greek, isopsophia, is 888. The Hebrews took possession of the promised land after 3 sets of 7 at Jericho. They marched around 7 times on the 7th day of marching, while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets. The first of the Bruins' goals against the Red Wings was scored by player 37, which hints at 3 sets of 7. This goal was his 1,000th goal of his career. Just so happens, his exact 1,000th goal of his career. This hints at Jesus' rule in the 1,000 years of peace after his second coming. And again, this goal was scored in the second period and all of that. Which is why, after player 37's goal, the second goal, that was also scored in the second period, was scored 88 seconds later. All right? So, what I didn't really make clear earlier is that the second goal of the 2 goals was player 37's goal. This was the goal that was the second goal, in other words, second coming, in the second period, and tied the score at 2-2. This hints at 3 sets of 7, and it was his 1,000th goal, which hints at the 1,000 years of peace after Jesus' second coming. But this second goal was scored after 88 seconds, and 88 hints at 888, which is the numeric value of the name Jesus in Greek. It's absolutely astounding. The second goal in the second period, the first goal of the 2 goals was player 37's goal. All right. So I was right the first time. Okay. I just misread what I just wrote, which is why after player 37's goal, the second goal, meaning the other goal, was also scored in the second period and 88 seconds after the first goal, which hints at the 3 sets of 7. Okay. So the second goal in the second period was scored by player 27. 27 equals 9 plus 9 plus 9. The game was, and this is again an emphasis of the number 9, which symbolizes God's judgment, the most important number in God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections. This game was 9 plus 9 plus 9 years after the Red Wings, the same team that they're playing, made the record of 50 wins in 66 games. The 9 equals God's judgment. This second goal in the second period by player 27, 88 seconds after the goal by player 37, 3 sets of 7 judgment, hints at Judgment Day at Jesus' second coming. The game was played on the date 3/11, March 11th. As has been explained, God uses the date 3/11 to point to Revelation 3:11 as a message for the church. Revelation 3:11, I am coming soon. Hold fast what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. Jesus said he is coming soon. This urgency regarding shortness of time is hinted at with the speed in which it took the Bruins to win 50 games. Furthermore, the speed in which it took to score these 2 goals, which were only 88 seconds apart, to tie the game. So the speediness of the first 50 games is what this is all about. That's the record. It's the 50th win in a record short period of games, short number of games, 64. And that's hinting at the urgency in Revelation 3:11, which is why this game occurred on the date 3:11. I am coming soon. Hold fast what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. The game was played in Boston, in the Boston Gardens, which is located at the mouth of the Charles River. John Winthrop's flotilla arrived in Boston and sailed up the Charles River. The Pilgrims' Massachusetts Bay Colony was the spiritual founding of America. The number 50 symbolizes the church, and this is why this win, this 50th win, was Boston's 50th win. Joseph died in Genesis chapter 50. He died 64 years before Moses was born. The deliverer was born. This is why the Bruins won 50 games in 64 games played. This was 64 days before the rebirth of Israel, and the Pilgrims saw their crossing of the Atlantic as a parallel to the Hebrews crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land. John Winthrop even mentioned this in his famous speech on the crossing, during the crossing. The Pilgrims' destination was the Charles River, which hints at the Jordan River. Joseph died 144 years before the Exodus. The Pilgrims anchored off Cape Cod in November of 1620. 144,000 days before the eclipse in 2015 that pointed to the Pilgrims' crossing of the Atlantic, as has been explained many times in other videos. But I'll just say here that that eclipse, the path of totality, marked an uncanny division between the old world and the new world. It was quite uncanny. I'll play a clip, a GIF of that. And you can see this is clearly symbolism for crossing the Atlantic. It would have been the path that they would have crossed. All right, because on a map, the crossing is an arc. It isn't a straight line on a map because the world is curved. Anyway, they would have crossed where the eclipse was made an uncanny demarcation between the old and the new world. But the point is that this came 144,000 days after the Pilgrims landed. And by the way, their crossing took 66 days, which is another confirmation of the prophetic relevance of this sign, because again, the 2 other teams, the Red Wings and the Lightning, won their 50 games in 66 games. Okay. But the Pilgrims crossing 144,000 days earlier before this eclipse. Now, this eclipse was it was on Nisan 1, which split the civil calendar into 2, and it was on the spring equinox, which is the day of the year that splits night and day evenly throughout the world, and it split the blood moon tetrad. The 4 blood moons, if you know what I'm talking about, this eclipse occurred in the middle of those 4 eclipses, between the second and third eclipse. And in other words, the reason for, the biggest reason of all, for the blood moon tetrad was to point to this eclipse. And this eclipse pointed to the crossing of the Pilgrims and the spiritual founding of America. Now, the thing is, 144,000 days is the equivalent of 400 biblical years, which means 12 months made up of 30-day months. That's 400 biblical years is exactly 144,000 days. And again, the number 144 is the big prominent number in the book of Revelation that symbolizes God's people that will be raptured, spared the tribulation period. 400 years is the amount of years that the Hebrews were in Egypt or afflicted and in slavery, right? Well, it's a symbolic 400 years, but in the timeline, it begins with the affliction of Ishmael and Isaac. That's exactly 400 years from then, the beginning of the affliction. And because Hagar was from Egypt. So anyway, that's in the Bible how 400 years symbolism, or it is referring to the Exodus from Egypt, from Pharaoh, a type for the Antichrist. Well, the Pilgrims landed in 1620, and 400 years later, we had the prophetic signs. It was November of 2020. What happened? What happened in November of 2020? What could have possibly been very significant in November of 2020? Well, I'll leave it for you to learn that. But anyway, there's way more to the confirmation of the 400 years. But this is symbolism for the Antichrist. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the presidency of President Trump was trumpeting the arrival of the Antichrist, because the Antichrist's presidencies will precede and come after Trump's presidency. And how did Trump become famous in the first place? How did he rise to political significance? Through his attack and calling out the biggest lie in all of history, which was Obama's birth certificate forgery. And so anyway, it's always been about Trump President Trump trumpeting the Antichrist, Barack Obama. And that's why 400 years. And that's why the eclipse, and that's why all of this here. And the Boston Bruins, who played this game at the mouth of the Charles River, which points to the founding of the spiritual founding of the nation with John Winthrop, and the Pilgrim's Crossing, which was 66 days. And so let's continue with what I wrote here. The Pilgrims anchored off Cape Cod in November of 1620, 144,000 days before the eclipse in 2015 that pointed to the Pilgrims' crossing of the Atlantic, as explained many times in my other videos. This Boston Bruins prophetic sign is pointing to Joseph and 144 years to the Exodus, right? Because again, this Boston Bruins game, as I've been explaining, pointed to Joseph. One being that Joseph died 64 years before Moses' birth, and Moses led the Hebrews out of Egypt, the type for Jesus, the deliverer. 144 symbolizes that. Well, anyway, and again, this game was 64 days before the 900th month anniversary of the rebirth of Israel. I've already explained that, right? So this Boston Bruins prophetic sign is pointing to that, and Joseph died 144 years before the Exodus, and 144,000 days after the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts, which is what the Boston Bruins points to, is this prophetic eclipse, which is the big eclipse that is a big prophetic sign that's communicating the end times. All right. And what happened after that eclipse, for that matter? Well, that was when Trump famously came down the golden escalator, the event that began it all, right? And began the stirring up the hornet's nest, the mass hysteria, the Trump derangement syndrome of the political cult of the left that has presently lost their mind because they are in league with Satan and have the spirit of Antichrist inside them. So that's what it's all about, right? And so anyway, yeah, Trump's presidency, it really all begins shortly after this eclipse. Okay, the rapture is a parallel of the Exodus. The Hebrews were afflicted for 400 years before the Exodus. The end of God's Gentile nation, America, and the end of the times of the Gentiles, quote unquote, which is in Bible prophecy, in the Bible, times of the Gentiles ending, and then the 1,000 years reign of the King of Kings, Lord Jesus Christ, at the time of the end of the Gentiles, and the restoration of Israel at the end of the time of the Gentiles. But America is God's Gentile nation, and God's Gentile nation, he is communicating, is a symbolic 400 years after its founding. That's what's being communicated here. Okay, so all this was pointed to with the 2015 eclipse. 400 biblical years is 144,000 days after the spiritual founding of the nation, with the landing at Plymouth Rock, because rock in the Bible symbolizes Jesus. This landing on Plymouth Rock was symbolism for the founding of America on Jesus, the rock. So I think I've explained that now. Robert Kennedy Jr. is from Massachusetts. He is a prophetic voice, I should say. He is a prophetic voice for God regarding the corruption in America. And God is using him in his signs as a prophet-like figure, if you will. And by the way, I believe this is the reason why, symbolically, Robert Kennedy Jr., has an issue, a physical issue with his voice. It's symbolism for how he is God's voice, if you will, speaking the truth and confronting the corruption in America. So on March 11th, this prophetic date we are talking about with this prophetic Boston Bruins game, Robert Kennedy Jr. tweeted that if the support is there, that he will run for president. He essentially announced that he was running for president on this day. His father and uncle also fought corruption. That's what they are known for. His father, RFK, and his uncle, JFK. What are they known for? And why were they assassinated by the CIA? Because they were threatening them. They were fighting corruption. Also on March 11th, the same date, the mansion that Jacqueline Kennedy lived in after moving out of the White House after the assassination of JFK due to his battling of corruption was listed for sale. Okay, so we have another Kennedy sign on this date 3/11. We have two Kennedy signs. Kennedy is synonymous with Massachusetts, if you will. I mean, Robert Kennedy Jr. still lives in Massachusetts, and the family is famously known for being from Massachusetts. Unlike even other politicians, where a state is associated with the actual politician. So it's a big Massachusetts sign, in other words. And that's important because, again, it was on the same day as this Boston game. And Boston is, of course, in Massachusetts as well. And this game was played in Boston. All right. So this story about Jacqueline Kennedy's mansion being listed for sale was a national news story on this day. The listing has 50 photos. And could this be a connection to the 50th win in Boston? She moved out in 1964. Could this be a connection to the 50th win in 64 games? The mansion has 13 bedrooms and 13 bathrooms. Wow. You know what? So I haven't read this since March. And I'm reading it as I'm reading it to you. And there's more connection here because, as I've already explained, Massachusetts is about the 54th. God is using Massachusetts to point to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. I explained that at the end of part 1, right? And I also explained the relevance of the number 13 in all of that because of the $13 that the regiment was supposed to have been paid, because that's what other Union soldiers were paid, and they were treated as lesser humans, which was symbolism for minority laws, oppressive minority laws, and on, as I explained. The Exodus from Egypt, minority laws, right? So this 13 bedrooms and 13 bathrooms and tied into these Massachusetts signs right here is more confirmation of this signs, or how all of these signs are, in fact, a big story that God is communicating that is pointing to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. Okay, that's why it is Jacqueline Kennedy mansion prophetic sign, as I will now continue to explain. But that's astounding. All right. This news story talks about, and by the way, you could argue that 3:11 kind of hints at 13 too, because it has these numbers that are used in 13. And believe me, I don't think that's as much as it sounds like a stretch, probably to a lot of people. But given what I know about how God does his signs, it's actually probably not a stretch. But let's continue. The news story talks about how three mansions were combined into one property. This hints at the third term for the Antichrist, as from the Bible, the number 13, typo there, I forgot, number 13, is symbolic of the Antichrist, as I've explained, right? Nimrod, a type for the Antichrist, was the 13th generation from Ham. Haman, another type for the Antichrist, persecuted the Jews on the 13th days of the month. And the two Antichrists are described in the book of Revelation in chapter 13. The number 13 is also symbolism for the Antichrist, and that's why the $13 ultimately is also Antichrist symbolism, the Antichrist will enforce the mark of the Antichrist through the oppressive minority laws, right? That's all of why the 13. That's why the $13 in the first place. Besides the history of this mansion and its former occupant, Jacqueline Kennedy, arguably the most interesting part of the story is how the property developer combined these three mansions into one. This is a big part of the story. This is a prophetic sign, and so this is important. And three parts combined into one gives us the number 1 and 3, which is why this hints at 13. And again, there are 13 bedrooms and 13 bathrooms, which also give us the number 13. Okay, so the three mansions were combined into one property. That's also symbolism for the three parts in one of the Trinity, of course, as well. But this three mansions combined into one hints at the third term as well for the Antichrist. That's why there's 13 bedrooms and 13 bathrooms, because it's the Antichrist symbolism. As from the Bible, the number 13 is symbolism for the Antichrist. Pharaoh, a type for the Antichrist, and the Hebrews were persecuted or were afflicted for 400 years. And 400 biblical years after the Pilgrims' landing in Massachusetts at the beginning of America points to the arrival of the Antichrist at the end of America. The Antichrist will rise to power as a result of the death of the vice president. Jacqueline Kennedy moved out of the White House as a result of the death of the president. In fact, there are more correlations in God's big picture of signs that confirm how God is also using Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, to hint at the death of the politician in the White House, to hint at the coming death of the vice president, which will lead to the rise of the Antichrist after she will be replaced. So Jacqueline Kennedy moved out of the White House as a result of the death of the president. Obama was born exactly 120 weeks exactly after the death of Kennedy, John F. Kennedy. And as explained in my videos, this isn't even scratching the surface of the connection between the two, between Kennedy and Barack Obama. Let me see. Well, just another quick one. Obama, speaking of 50, Obama was the first president to visit Puerto Rico as a sitting president in literally 50 years. And the president prior to that was John F. Kennedy. And the reason for that ultimately is that Barack Obama was born exactly 9 years after the passage of the first law of the Constitution, which a new Constitution of Puerto Rico, after they became independent from they established more autonomy from America. Their first constitution, the first law was Constitution Day. And that law was passed, law number 1, on August 4th, 9 years exactly before Obama was born. Now, 9 years connection is extremely prophetic in God's signs because number 9 symbolizes God's judgment, right? So there are many 9 years connections to confirm the relevance of this 9 years connection. But the thing about Constitution Day is that Constitution Day in America is the date 9/17. And God uses 9/17 to reveal the identity of Barack Obama, the Antichrist, who will remove constitutional rights. But in fact, more accurately, in Bible prophecy, the Antichrist will in fact simply take over the Antichrist system. The Antichrist system will already be in place, as it already is, and is so increasingly every day. The Antichrist system is being built by the political cult of the left that is persecuting, whether they know it or not, their arch enemy, true Christians. That's what it's all about. The ones that are standing up for truth and the Constitution. And so, but anyway, so 9/17, Barack Obama was the president from 2009 until 2017. He arrived first as a senator from Illinois in the 109th Congress and lived on 109th Street while studying at Columbia University, and will return to the District of Columbia as a result of the shenanigans that brought the president to power in the 117th Congress, which was really the beginning of the mark of the Antichrist thing. That's when it first came out, right? And and furthermore, the home run king took the thing on the first day of the 117th Congress, right? So, and on and on. In fact, well, Barack Obama was the rainbow president who lit up the White House in rainbow colors. And that was on, and the rainbow is God's sign regarding judgment, recorded in the last verse of the book of Genesis in chapter 9, verse 17. And he lit up the White House in rainbow colors on the 9th of Tammuz in the Hebrew calendar. And in the Bible, on the 9th of Tammuz and the 17th of Tammuz were the two dates when the Babylonians, and then later, centuries later, the Romans breached the walls of security of Jerusalem in God's judgment. So anyway, that's why 9/17. I went off onto a rabbit trail. I sometimes do that. I apologize. Hopefully that was worthwhile, though. Returning back to Kennedy and Obama, though, there are many connections, all right? Now, the mansion that Jacqueline Kennedy lived in is located on 3017 North Street in the zip code 20007 in the city with the area code 202. That's the Washington, D.C. area code. 202 hints at 22. And in God's signs, the number 22 is symbolism for the mark of the Antichrist. And the Antichrist will be in power in Washington, D.C. Again, the reason why 22 symbolizes the mark of the Antichrist is because the inverse of the mark of the Antichrist that is described in Ezekiel chapter 9 would have been a Tav mark. And the Tav letter in the Hebrew alphabet is the last letter and the 22nd letter. And the mark of the Antichrist is described in the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, which is the 22nd of 22 books in the Bible that have a total of 22 chapters. Okay, and so the zip code of 2007 of this mansion hints at 27. And again, 27 is an emphasis of the number 9, which is symbolism for God's judgment. The address, 3017, hints at Strong's G317, by way of compulsion, unwillingly, by force, necessarily. The mark of the Antichrist will be compulsory, by force, unwillingly. That's the whole point. It'll be a test of faith for those that refuse it. Taking it will be tantamount to denying Jesus, and not taking it will be standing up for truth and righteousness. And I say that in future tense, but I shouldn't, because it's already ongoing. The mark of the many people have already taken the mark of the Antichrist, including many Christians, quote unquote Christians. This mansion sign and the Boston 50 church sign, which is the Boston Bruins 50th win sign, is exactly 36 months after 3/11, March 11th, 2020, COVID-19 day. As I began this part 2 video with explaining why God uses the date 3/11. Well, this 3/11 date is exactly 36 months after that date. And again, the number 36 is symbolism for 666, because 36 is 6 times 6, but also 2 times 18, which is 6 plus 6 plus 6. And the 36th triangular number is 666, because in a triangle of numbers, the last number on the 36th row is 666, and 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 all the way to 36 equals 666. Okay, now one of the other signs on this day, besides the official declaration by the World Health Organization that coronavirus is a pandemic and Trump's prophetic Oval Office speech, many other signs, but including the sign of all the signs on that date, which was because that's what the purpose of it all is this football news story sign. It was a national sports news story because at the time, everything was shutting down immediately. The NBA shut down on that day, coincidentally, after the player that had just a couple of days prior to that mocked coronavirus. On this day, he was the first player to have tested positive for coronavirus. Yeah, that was an amazing sign by God. But this football sign that I'm referring to was the news story about how it involved 4 football teams, okay? It involved the Philadelphia Eagles, the New Orleans Saints, the Kansas City Chiefs, and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, all of these 4 teams, coincidentally, are the 4 teams that God uses as symbolism for the church and judgment for the church. Because, as Peter said, judgment begins with the church. And that's why there's 50. That's why the 50 photos in this mansion prophetic sign and the 50th win and Boston symbolizing the church and all of the rapture symbolism, the Church of Philadelphia, the sign, the date itself symbolizing the Church of Philadelphia and therefore the church that will be left behind because the Philadelphia church will be the only church that will be raptured. Okay, so this is, in other words, the main theme of God's big picture of signs is judgment for the church. Because the reason for the end times is the church. The whole purpose of God's creation is the church. But the purpose of the Antichrist is also for the church, primarily. I mean, if God were simply to want to just judge the unrighteous, and that's it, you could just do that in a minute. But the purpose of the Antichrist is to test the faith of God's Christians, the faithful, right? And because there are many, many Christians that need to demonstrate their faith. Saving faith, which is how we are saved. It's through a saving faith. It's a demonstration of faith. There's 2 parts to faith. There's believing, like Abraham did when he was promised in the book of Genesis. And then later, after, God asked Abraham to sacrifice his only son, which was, of course, a shadow of Jesus Christ, God's only son. And as Abraham was about to do so and obey God, God sent an angel to tell Abraham to stop. Don't harm the boy, for now I know that you fear me. In other words, prior to that, God didn't know. Obviously, that's the simplest way to read the text. Furthermore, that's confirmed with countless other passages in the Bible that the Calvinists ignore or twist to fit their Gnostic theology, and Reformed theology, which is rooted in Gnosticism. And I mean that literally. I mean, Augustine was a Gnostic for 9 years, and he is the root of the Lutheran Calvinist theology, Reformed theology, right? The Reformation was a revivification of Gnostic Augustine theology. And furthermore, Calvin titled his writings Systematic Augustinianism, and Luther was an Augustinian monk. So anyway, that's the root of the bad doctrine. That's the root of the bad tree that is the church today. And anyway, saving faith is a demonstration of one's faith, which typically comes with risk and sacrifice. More could be said about that. The true meaning of the word believe in the most quoted passage of John 3:16. It means to continually believe, for one thing. It's not a one-time thing. And but the better translation of that, because the word believe meant something different back in the 1600s, it is more closely aligned with the word commit. And it means to continually commit to Jesus and faith in Jesus, in other words. So anyway, that's the reason for all of this. But this particular sign right here, the news story was how the coaches of these teams were being pulled from the road. Because at this time of year in March, the coaches are on the road at the scouting events to scout the college players. And the news story was how the coaches for the Philadelphia Eagles, Church of Philadelphia, Kansas City Chiefs, which is also symbolism for the church, explained in other videos, but it's symbolism for the Pentecost, their uniform is fire. They won the Super Bowl after their 50th year of not being in the Super Bowl, and they played the 49ers, and Pentecost is a 49-day and a 50-day count. Anyway, the Chiefs also symbolize the church, and the Steelers symbolize the thief in the night, Jesus, that comes to rescue the church at the rapture. But the New Orleans Saints, led by the quarterback player number 9, which symbolizes God's judgment, at one time the passing king, Antichrist king symbolism, Drew Brees, God has been using the New Orleans Saints as in judgment for the church signs, the saints, because unlike what Catholics believe, the word saints in the Bible is referring to God's faithful, the followers of Jesus. Anyway, these 3 teams said they were pulling their coaches, but the Saints organization said that they would be conducting business as usual, which was the most stark condemnation of the church you could think of, because in light of all of what's happening and the unrighteousness around them and the beginning of the COVIDian and the beginning of the COVID nightmare and the political cult anyway, the New Orleans Saints organization said it would be conducting business as usual, which is the exact response of the majority of the church, especially and including the evangelical church. I say especially because God especially points to the evangelical church in his signs, God, the American church. But as Jesus said in the book of Revelation, God reproves whom he loves. So that's why all this is judgment for the church, though. How will God prove this to the world, that this information is true? How will he prove everything that I'm saying is true? The Bruins record was 9 + 9 + 9 years after the Red Wings record, which was 23 years before the Lightning tied the record. From this game on March 11, 2023, and this Boston game, Massachusetts game, and Jacqueline Kennedy's mansion sign on this same date in the zip code 2007, which hints at 27, which hints at the 9 + 9 + 9 years I just mentioned, to the Red Wings record. From this day, March 11th, 2023, it is 111 days to the date it is predicted that Kamala Harris will die in a plane crash. This pairs 9 and 11, which is how God's signs works. He pairs numbers together like 9 and 11 to confirm the signs and connections. Okay, so when Kamala Harris's death, when she dies in a plane crash, in other words, this will prove everything that I'm saying. And that is the point. That's the purpose of the prediction from God. It's not neat. It's not just entertainment. It's not for supposed encouragement for the faithful. It's to prove that the God of the Bible is the true God, first and foremost. It's to prove the gospel. But it's also to prove what I have just said about judgment for the church. Make no mistake. The thing is the mark of the Antichrist. Many Christians have already taken it because they were conducting business as usual. They did not understand the times that they were in because they had rejected knowledge. And as the prophet Hosea said, my people have rejected knowledge, therefore I reject them from being my priests. God has rejected them, these Christians, the ones that have been conducting business as usual, the ones that have been wearing the MASKs inside the church, the holy place of worship, if you will, the unrighteous precursor to the mark of the Antichrist, and churches that have disallowed people that didn't take the thing to be in the church, and churches that closed their doors to this nonsense because the government told them to. This is what I'm talking about. This is judgment for the church. God is extremely displeased with the American church, and this is why the end times are happening now. And this is the reason for the Antichrist. It is the church. It is persecution of the church because it is a testing of faith for the church. It's a wake-up call for the church. It's a message to the church to fear the Lord, which the church does not do because of their Nicolaitan doctrine that Jesus said he hates and is coming to make war on with the sword of his mouth on those that teach and have the works that are a product of this doctrine that causes these Christians to not fear God and to be complacent, to be the church of Laodicea, which, as Jesus said, thinks that it is in need of nothing. I mean, that perfectly describes the American evangelical church, but it's because of their doctrine. They don't fear the Lord. And in fact, many, if they're hearing this, are cringing with even the concept of fearing the Lord. That's, to them, to many in their heretical doctrine, that's Old Testament stuff. Christians don't fear the Lord. That's the Old Testament. That's what they would say. That would be their theological response. But the whole point is to fear the Lord. It's a healthy thing. It's a rejuvenating thing. It's what brings the Holy Spirit into one's being. It's a fear of the Lord. There's countless passages about the fear of the Lord. David talked about his fear of the Lord and how it was a beautiful thing, for example, in the book of Psalms. And like I said, Genesis 22, which isn't a coincidence that the number 22 symbolizes the mark of the Antichrist, because in Genesis chapter 22 is where it is demonstrated a necessity to fear the Lord for salvation. And that's exactly the opposite of what the Gnostic doctrine of our day produces. Calvinism, sovereign grace, and free grace, which come in the packages of Calvinism and dispensationalism, and both lead to once saved, always saved. And the myth of imputed righteousness, as evangelicals understand it. And our righteousness is as filthy rags, one verse that Luther took out of context and twisted to develop his entire theology. And all Christians will be raptured, etc. So anyway, make sure you watch the 23 church signs video on this channel. But continuing on, also, Kennedy is about the death of a politician and the subsequent Jacqueline Kennedy and the mansion. And again, let's not forget that Robert Kennedy Jr. Announced his presidency on this day. Kennedy is about the death of a politician and the subsequent change in the White House. This game is exactly 4 times 4 weeks, because 111 days is also exactly 4 times 4 weeks, which hints at the number 44, before Harris's crash. 4 times 4 weeks pairs with 23 years. Again, these two other records were 9 plus 9 years and then 23 years. 88 seconds in between the two goals, remember, is 2 times 44, which hints at the second presidency for the 44th president. All right, so later in this email thread, I wrote here, and like the Paul Simon Mansion sign, the Kennedy Mansion sign hints at the rapture of the 144,000. So there is another prophetic sign that I'm referring to here involving a mansion. And Jesus said in the book of John, chapter 14, that there would be many mansions for those of us when we arrive in the kingdom. And he will be preparing them for us. And so anyway, there is another mansion sign, and this sign is about the rapture. It regards Paul Simon, the songwriter and musician that wrote the song Bridge Over Troubled Water. And this is such an amazing story. I haven't told it yet in the videos. I will. And it is predicted that Paul Simon will die on January 3rd, 2024. And anyway, it'll be a prophetic sign that will be communicating, it will symbolize the soon coming rapture. Anyway, that's why in other words, this is a second witness to a mansion sign. In other words, this Kennedy mansion sign, this Jacqueline Kennedy mansion sign, which also hints at the rapture, as I have explained, isn't the first one. And that's how God's signs works. It works on the principle of second and third multiple witnesses that confirm a matter as the Bible says is required. Also, the mansion, Jacqueline Kennedy's mansion, is listed for $26 million. The Hebrew gematria value of the name of God, Yahweh, is 26. So this number is appropriate for the price of this mansion. The 430th word in Strong's Greek New Testament Concordance is the word God. And these signs are pointing to the Hebrews' timeline to the Exodus. That's what I have been explaining in this video, right? I have explained that. Which was 430 years after the promise to Abraham. The Exodus was 430 years after the promise to Abraham and 400 years after the affliction, as I explained earlier. One amazing thing I just realized is the deeper meaning of the flying goal. Bobby Orr, player 4, scored the 1970 Stanley Cup Series winning goal in Game 4. The Bruins won the series 4-0, 4-0. And this goal in the Game 4 came with 40 seconds into overtime, which is the fourth period. And then Bobby Orr was tripped by St. Louis Blues player number 4 and went flying into the air. As I explained earlier, the most iconic photo in sports history, one of them. The most famous goal as well, which engendered one of the most iconic sports photos in history. I had thought that these 4s were symbolic of the 44th president, because the flying goal is okay, as I explain here, and they are. The Antichrist that the raptured will fly from in the escape. So the flying goal is symbolism, hints at the rapture from the persecution of the Antichrist, the 44th president. And that was deemed the conclusion for why the 4s in this flying goal. However, like this game on March 11th, this Boston Bruins game against the Red Wings, the 50th win in 64 games, a record, this flying goal was in Boston. So the Boston flying goal was in Boston, but the game, although it was involved the Boston Bruins, it was also in Boston, as was this game on March 11th, 2023. And like I said earlier, the arena they play in is at the mouth of the Charles River. And I know this because I used to live in Boston for 5 years. In fact, when people ask me, because it was the most recent place I lived really, and when people ask me where am I from, for the sake of saying something, I say I'm from Boston. And so anyway, that's another example of how this ministry was made for me, because as I explained in the East Palestine video, I was born in Mississauga, the place, and one of my first memory was of the bomb train evacuation, the largest evacuation in North American history. And, I explained that earlier, but this is another example because it all ties together here. And in fact, as I will explain later, Mississauga is actually hinting at Massachusetts. Because Hurricane Hazel, the hurricane was in 1954, and the mayor, as I explained, is the prophetic sign in the East Palestine Mississauga bomb train signs, and she was named after the Hurricane Hazel, which was in 1954. The mayor of Mississauga, 1954, hints at the 54th Massachusetts regiment. Sorry to interrupt. This is how it works, though. It's really, that's how it works. God's big picture of signs is an interconnected web, and it's very, very difficult to explain a part of the web without pulling on the entire web. And I went off onto a rabbit trail, so I apologize. Let's return. It was this series of 4s, and I had originally thought that it was pointing to the 44th president. But as I'm explaining here, both the flying goal and this game on March 11th, 2023 were in Boston at the mouth of the Charles River. The 4s in the flying goal are pointing to the 400 years from the pilgrims anchoring on November 11th, 1620. Amazing. Now, you know what I just realized is that this date here, the 400th anniversary of this date, was an extremely prophetic sign. It was the 9/11 mayor sign when he first presented the evidence for the thing that happened 8 days earlier, if you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, that's a long story. It's explained in other videos. But the point is this date here, which was exactly, the event that happened 8 days before November 11th, 2020, that event was exactly 999 weeks after 9/11. And anyway, so the point is that, what was I going to say? This date here in 2020 is exactly 9 plus 9 plus 9 months to this March 11th game. Okay, so you have the 400th anniversary connecting extremely prophetically with the Boston Bruins game that hints at the flying goal. Because it all ties together, and like I explained already, so I won't explain it again. I explained it. It's a big time ties all together, right? I explained that earlier, though. So that's very relevant, because that's what and this sign, the signs in that connected and were a part of the 9/11 mayor sign on November 11th, 2020, the exact 400th anniversary of the anchoring of the Pilgrims off of Cape Cod. That involved all kinds of nines. In fact, it was so overwhelming, the amount of nines in that. And so we have and this is the first time I'm realizing it, and that happens all the time, right? Every time I go over the information, something new occurs to me, right? So anyway, yeah, this Boston Bruins sign is exactly 9 plus 9 plus 9 months after the 400th anniversary. So this is massive judgment warning for America. Because again, it's all about this 400th anniversary, which is symbolism for the arrival of the Antichrist, because of the 400 years that the Hebrews were persecuted in Egypt by the Pharaoh, who was a type for the Antichrist. And like the Hebrews in Egypt, who were escaped religious persecution from the Pharaoh, a type for the Antichrist, the Pilgrims were also escaping religious and political persecution, which God is communicating the period of 400 years is now over, and Christians in America will again be persecuted religiously and politically. That's what this is exactly communicating. Okay, so that's what I'm saying here, is that the flying goal isn't about the 40. It isn't so much about 44 and the 44th president. It is, but it's also more importantly, or more precisely, about the 400 years. And this is proven by the next thing that I wrote here. The 40 seconds confirms this, because it could have easily have been 44 seconds into the overtime. But it was 40 seconds, which hints at 400. It hints at 400. And yeah. By the way, another thing too, exactly 7 months, because in Bible prophecy, the end times period of the Antichrist is symbolized by 7 years. And it is only symbolism. We are well inside the final 7 years. But it is symbolized by 7 years, and that's why 7 months in God's big picture of signs is symbolism for the 7 years. And exactly 7 years after this was the day that the man was inside the whale, right exactly where the Pilgrims anchored. It was right off the shore of Provincetown, Cape Cod, right where they anchored. And this man was a diver. He is a diver for, I believe it's lobsters. And so he was down near where the anchor was. He was down in the depths of the ocean, and a whale happened to be feeding and caught him inside its mouth, which was a Jonah inside the whale sign, a prophetic sign, because of course in the Bible, Jonah was inside the whale. And this isn't the only Jonah whale sign. And speaking of second and third witnesses, but I won't go into that other Jonah whale sign, but it is amazing. And I've explained it many other times in other videos. But the point here is that exactly 7 months after the 400th anniversary of the anchor off of the Cape Cod, exactly on June 11th, 2021, was the day that this man was inside the whale, after he was right at the, he wasn't even on the surface. He was down deep in the water, and that would have been where they anchored, where the anchor would have been, in other words. It's symbolism for that. Okay, so let's move on with what I was saying here. So the 40 seconds confirms that it's hinting at 400, because it could have easily have been 44 seconds. And this is why the St. Louis Blues, the last of the 6 1967 expansion teams to win the Stanley Cup, the St. Louis Blues, when they beat Boston in the extremely prophetic 2019 Stanley Cup. Okay, so the St. Louis Blues hadn't been in a Stanley Cup since 1970, when they lost to Boston with the flying goal. And then they happened to play Boston the next time that they were in the Stanley Cup, 49 years later in 2019, and it was again against Boston. And that prophetic sign, and the St. Louis Blues 2019 Blues, was a massive prophetic sign. So much is involved, and I've explained it in other videos. But that ended with the shout of the 50,000 Blues fans. Sorry, that's a typo. 500,000 Blues fans in the victory parade under the Gateway Arch. And in the Bible, judgment begins on a people symbolically at the gates. And that's why this prophetic sign at the Gateway Arch, St. Louis is known for the Gateway Arch, the gateway to the west, because of the Lewis and Clark expedition that began exactly 144 years before Israel was reborn on May 14th, 1948. The Lewis and Clark expedition began in St. Louis on March 14th, 1804. Anyway, but the shouting of the Blues fans was on Pentecost, which is symbolism for the church and the rapture, and the Pentecost means 50, and that's why the 500,000 Blues fans. But the shouting, which I explain in other videos, and I won't explain everything to confirm that. And here is an example of how it just goes on, because it's a web, and I'm trying to pull on one part of the web, and here I go. But anyway, the shouting is symbolism for the shouting before the walls of security collapsed on Jericho. After the Hebrews, they marched around 7 times, and then they blew the trumpets, and then they shouted, and then the walls of security collapsed. And that's why the shouting of victory, because the Blues sign is all about a big part of it is the shouting of the song Gloria. The Blues players they started a tradition of playing the song Gloria in the locker room, the 1980s pop hit Gloria, and that turned into a big thing, including for the fans. And that began this tradition of shouting Gloria, and that's symbolic of the shouting when the walls of security collapsed. And the reason why Pentecost is because in 2018, 2019, and 2020, including this was in 2019, God demonstrated amazing trail of prophetic signs that coincided with the timing of events in the book of Joshua that climaxed with the symbolic walls of security collapsing on Jericho on Pentecost in those years. Anyway, the Blues nickname is Blue and Whites, and so are things associated with Israel. Colloquially, they are called Blue and Whites. The things that are made in Israel, there's a political party, Blue and Whites, for example. And so, yeah, and as I was saying earlier, the Blues became a team in 1967, the year that the NHL expanded and the same year that Israel expanded. And the NHL was born in the same month in 1917 as the Balfour Declaration, as I explained earlier. And so anyway, yeah, I said this already too. Okay, so let's move on. All right, here is the passage from John 14. In my Father's house there are many mansions. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? John 14:2. Also, the final score of the game was 2-3. This prophetic Boston game, when again they won their 50th game, the fastest team in history to reach 50 wins. It was in Boston. So the correct way to say this score is 2-3, which hints at 23. In fact, the main reason why 23 is used is because Jesus said the rooster would not crow twice before Peter would deny him 3 times. He said this in the Gospel of Mark. And the reason why that's the case is because the denial of Jesus is 23, or in other words, 2 and 3, the rooster not crowing twice before Peter would deny Jesus 3 times, is symbolism for the denial of Jesus, and taking the mark of the Antichrist is tantamount to denying Jesus. And this is why the Antichrist's, the basketball president, his jersey number was 23. But from this 2-3 game in Massachusetts and Kennedy signs, again, Kennedy, the family, is associated with Massachusetts, that hint at the death of Kamala Harris, because as I explained, God is demonstrating signs that are related to John F. Kennedy to hint at the death of Harris, another politician in the White House. It is exactly 4 times 4 weeks to Harris's predicted crash. And this gives us a pairing of 23 and 44. There's much more to this, though, so I'll explain it in a second here. Exactly 4 times 4 weeks after this prophetic game on March 11th will be June 30th, the predicted date that Kamala Harris will die in a plane crash. The Pilgrims arrived after the arduous 66 days journey across the Atlantic. This is another reason why in this Boston sign, the previous record was 50 wins in 66 games. I explained that earlier. Okay, the Boston Bruins is the perfect team to use to point to the symbolism in the Pilgrim's Crossing and the spiritual founding of America, not only because they play at the mouth of the Charles River, but because it is a winter sport. They play on ice. The Pilgrims landed at the beginning of a cold winter. Winters were colder back then, not because of supposed anthropogenic global warming, though. Speaking of which, the eclipse, it's natural cycles, if you don't know. The winters were colder back then because of natural cycles, and that was because of a mini ice age making it colder than it previously was before that. There's these cycles, right? And that's proven in the historical record. And so the global warming, global climate change theology is a religion, and it's a political cult. It's part of the political cult of the left that no longer worships God, and so they worship things like the environment and their virtue signaling and leftist ideologies, collectivism, etc. It's, in other words, it's communism in disguise, climate crisis propaganda. Okay, speaking of which, the eclipse in 2015 that I mentioned points to the Pilgrim's Crossing, the eclipse that split the blood moon tetrad, which was the main purpose of the blood moon tetrad, was exactly 400 weeks before this. Now, what I'm referring to here, okay, is this COP27 UN Climate Change Summit in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. Okay, it was in Egypt. It was on the Sinai Peninsula. And again, Egypt is the book of Exodus. But that's why this climate change summit was on the Sinai Peninsula. It was a mocking of the Bible, including by people that claim to be students of the Bible, Jews and Christians, that did this thing. Let me see if I explain it better here. The pilgrims saw their crossing and escape from political and religious persecution as a parallel of the Hebrews' deliverance from religious persecution in Egypt and the crossing of the Jordan River into the Promised Land. The Hebrews were escaping Pharaoh, who persecuted them for 400 years. The 2015 eclipse pointed to this, and it was 400 biblical years after November 1620. Exactly 400 weeks after the eclipse. Okay, so to the eclipse is 400 years, and then after the eclipse is 400 weeks exactly, was the final day of this summit that included the interfaith leaders gathering and their blasphemous climate change 10 commandments. That was what I was alluding to a minute ago. These interfaith leaders came together on top of the mountain and did their blasphemous ritual with the climate change 10 commandments. Complete, utter blasphemy. Blasphemy is serious sin if you don't know the meaning. Earlier that same month, on March 2015, Harrison Ford crashed onto the golf course in California, which is the 31st state. Isaiah 31 begins with the first verse, "Woe to those who go down to Egypt." In the Indiana Jones movie, Harrison Ford, went down to Egypt. Okay, so that's why he crashed his plane in the 31st state. Harrison Ford starred in this Indiana Jones movie, which God is using. It's very, very important. So is Harrison Ford. I explain this in other videos. One thing that God is using Harrison Ford for is his aviation mishaps and his aviation hobby, to point to the death of Kamala Harris, hence Harrison Ford, in a plane crash. Okay, so 400 weeks after this crash was November 3rd, 2023, and the Jeremy Pena Plymouth Rock Pilgrim's sign. So I apologize. To explain that would be to go onto a rabbit trail. It's explained in other videos, though. And it's very, very important. It's amazing. The signs, this is what I call a super date. One of these dates with all of these many signs together. Okay, now the Pena sign makes even more sense. So through Jeremy Pena, who played for the Plymouth Pilgrims baseball team, he was the MVP of the 2022 World Series. This sign involved him on this day. It involved number 4. It was his 4th home run, come to think of it, of the World Series, okay? I believe it was hit in the 4th inning as well. And it was hit in Harris, where he plays for the team for Harris County anyway, the Houston team. Anyway, this was 400 weeks after that, so that's relevant, right? But that in turn confirms the 400 weeks from the eclipse to the blasphemous interfaith leaders, because again, they both occurred in March of 2015. In fact, it was just, 15 days apart. And they both connect with 400 weeks exactly, all right? And the interfaith leaders thing, the Sinai Peninsula thing, the 10 commandments for the climate change blasphemy, which is Antichrist. The whole climate change hysteria is complete Antichrist, 100%. The prediction being made in this video is to prove the things that I am saying. Anyway, that was on the 18th of November, exactly 400 weeks after the eclipse on the spring equinox on March 20th, 2015. It's absolutely stunning, okay? More confirmation for all of what I'm saying here, this symbolism with Egypt and 400. Okay, and now we know the true reason for the interfaith climate change 10 commandments sign. It is this 400 weeks connection from the eclipse. It's amazing because, again, the eclipse was 400 years after the Pilgrims landed, which was 144,000 days because it was 400 biblical years. I'm in the process of editing this video right now, and I thought I would interject here and emphasize once again how astounding this is. It is beyond words astounding. From when the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, it is 400 biblical years, 144,000 days, to the eclipse that demarked the crossing of the Pilgrims across the Atlantic. The path of totality made an uncanny path that delineated the new world from the old world. And it was symbolism for the crossing. And then 400 weeks after that, we have the climate blasphemy in the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, which is about the Hebrews escaping, and so is the number 144,000. But this is the same month as the Jeremy Pena Plymouth Rock sign. And that is also 400 weeks back to the crash in the 31st state of Harrison Ford in March of 2015. And in March in 2015 was the eclipse. And so in other words, essentially, if you have the mind to see it, it is 400 years to the eclipse. And then from Plymouth Rock, the Pilgrims on Plymouth Rock, and then 400 weeks to the Jeremy Pena Plymouth Rock sign, the baseball player that played for the Plymouth Pilgrims. And the prophetic sign in the World Series, he ended up being the MVP. And that particular date was Game 5, I believe, or Game 4. But the point of the sign was how it pointed to his college days. And that's who he played for in college, the Plymouth Pilgrims. And it was the news story was about how he had hit only 6 home runs in all of his college career, but had hit 4 home runs in the World Series. And so that's what made it a reference to his days at Plymouth Pilgrims. But there's more to that, like I said, which is explained in the other videos. That's just one thing that confirms the prophetic significance of how Jeremy Pena, and his name means rock. Pena means rock, if I failed to mention that. And he played for the Plymouth Pilgrims. And that sign was 400 weeks exactly after the sign in March, which was 400 years exactly after the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. It's absolutely astounding. And one more thing, too, is that Harrison Ford crashed in the 31st state, which hints at Isaiah chapter 31, woe to those who go down to Egypt. And then 400 weeks later, we have the Sinai Peninsula sign in Egypt. And Pharaoh persecuted, the Hebrews were afflicted for 400 years by Pharaoh in Egypt. And that's why the 400 years and the 400 weeks connection. It all ties together. Because just like the Hebrews that were escaping religious persecution, the Pilgrims were also escaping religious and political persecution. And all of these prophetic signs are for the purpose of God communicating that Christians will now be, once again, persecuted religiously and politically in America by the Antichrist, for which Pharaoh in Egypt is a prophetic type. And the Hebrews were persecuted in Egypt for 400 years. All right, I made a slight error. I mixed it up a bit. From Harrison Ford's crash in the 31st state, which hints at Isaiah chapter 31, which begins with woe to those who go down to Egypt, and Harrison Ford crashed went down into the 31st state. From that day, it is exactly 400 weeks to the Jeremy Pena sign and the other signs, which there are many, that occurred on November 3rd. All right. And that date was known ahead of time to be a date that would be in the trail of signs leading to the predicted date of Kamala Harris's plane crash, which is why the Harrison Ford aviation mishaps. Okay. It is from the eclipse that it is 400 weeks to the blasphemous conference in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. That's astounding. Because again, that eclipse, which was 400 biblical years after the Pilgrims landed and they saw their crossing of the Atlantic as a parallel with the Hebrews' escape from Egypt, 400 biblical years later was the eclipse that delineated a path on the map that pointed to the Pilgrims' crossing. And then 400 weeks after that is the prophetic sign in Egypt, the blasphemous Sinai Peninsula sign in Egypt. Okay, the blasphemous interfaith climate change 10 commandments on top of Mount Sinai on the last day of the UN summit there on the peninsula was exactly 44 years after Earth, Wind, and Fire, the band, released their hit song September. Okay? Fire came down and scorched the earth on Mount Sinai when the 10 Commandments were given. The lyrics of the song are about the date September 21st. Okay? The song goes, do you remember the 21st day of September, right? That disco song by Earth, Wind, and Fire, okay? It was released exactly 44 years before the interfaith ceremony with the 10 Commandments, okay? On September 21st, 2 months earlier, in 2022, the S&P 500, G500 Antichrist, as I explained, lost 66 points, which is Antichrist symbolism. The S&P 500 closed at 3,789.93. G, 3,789, in other words, the 3,789th word in Strong's Greek New Testament Concordance, is the word for snake or serpent, which is Antichrist. Of course, Satan is the snake symbolizes Satan in the Bible. 93 hints at 93 million miles, which is the distance between the Earth and the Sun. That's why, for example, Flight 93 on 9/11 with 44 deaths. That's another story. Sorry, I don't want to go off onto another rabbit trail. Of course, it's the 44th president and the predicted sun explosion that's coming up in 2024, the solar flare. Okay, Michelle Obama announced on this day, September 21st, a 6-city tour for her new book, We Carry the Light. 2 Corinthians 11:14. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. The tour ended with Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, which hints at the Antichrists and fallen angels. So the second Antichrist is from Chicago. The first Antichrist is Pope Francis, which is what is hinted at with San Francisco. And the dragon is thrown down from heaven to earth with his angels in Revelation chapter 12. And that's what Los Angeles hints at, because it is Spanish for the angels. And so that's why her last 3 cities of this 6-city tour, which is Antichrist, was these last 3 cities. From the 10 climate change commandments, it is exactly 66 weeks to the date of the predicted catastrophic solar flare on the sun. Earth, Wind, and Fire. Which is why the song is about September 21st. And why on September 21st, the S&P 500 lost 66 points on the day that she announced her 6-city tour, and why it was 3,789.93, as the 93 hints at the sun. September 21st was also the day of the opening of the UN, in which the main story was how the 44-year-old leader of the 44 million nation, Ukraine, was originally 44 million. And at the time, and for pretty much the entire first year of the war, the leader of that nation was 44 years old, including on the first day, which is the important thing, the symbolic beginning, when it was 44 million, was permitted to speak at the assembly remotely. This was an exception that was made. First time ever, our leader was permitted to speak remotely to the assembly. This connects to the UN COP27 climate summit on Mount Sinai. The Antichrist 44th president will lead the UN, probably after the solar flare. So, all right, so this hinted at the 44th president. That's why the SNP, on the same day that the 44-year-old spoke, that led the 44 million nation, spoke remotely at the UN, at the opening of the UN, the first day of the assembly. That's why on the same day, the 66 points loss and the 6-city tour, which hints at 666, of the Antichrist's wife, and the S&P 500 is the number for the Antichrist, G500. And we have this number that means snake, 3,789. And we have this number 93, and this is September 21st. And the COP27 climate change nonsense, which is related to the UN, of course, it was a UN thing. It was a UN thing. The interfaith thing coincided with the UN COP27 thing on the peninsula. And from that day, which is 44 years exactly after the Earth, Wind, Fire September 21st sign, it is exactly 66 weeks to the predicted date of the catastrophic solar flare that will cause catastrophic power outages on Earth. This is absolutely astounding. Completely stunning, as I wrote right here. So, 9/21 and Michelle's tour announcement was exactly 17 weeks to the date 117, which hints at 1 times 17 equals 17. Okay, that's in 2023, 117. On that day, she turned 59 years old. That's her birthday. Okay, so from this Michelle Obama sign, it is exactly 17 weeks to the date 117, which hints at 17, and it's her birthday. She turned 59 years old, and 59 is the 17th prime number. I don't know if I mentioned that in a minute or not. It was exactly 144 weeks in between the first legalization of abortion in the state that joined the Union in 1959 to the departure from the moon in the Apollo 17 mission. 2 planes, 17 minutes apart, 2 shuttle disasters, 17 years apart. And they are almost exactly 17 years apart, and they are commemorated on the same day every year, February 1st, because they occurred almost exactly on the same day of the calendar year. And it was 17 years apart, and because of the reason why is because the 2 planes that struck the 2 towers on 9/11 were 17 minutes apart. And the reason for that is because of the Apollo 17 mission. And that's because the moon symbolizes Christ. And the Apollo 17 mission was the last time an American was on the moon, which symbolized the departure of America from Christ, which is why the departure from the moon was exactly 144 weeks after the first state legalized abortion. There's tons more to this. Comet E3 in the upcoming helicopter video, for example. I'll post the link in an email. So there's way more to this. 117 was the day Comet E3 was in Draco, which is the constellation of the dragon, which is from Revelation chapter 12, and symbolism for the Satan and the Antichrist. And this description of this dragon in Revelation chapter 12 involves a tail of the dragon, the dragon's tail. And on this day, the comet E3, its tail was disconnected due to solar winds, earth, wind, and fire. Okay, so more connection, which is stunning confirmation for September 21st because of Earth, Wind, and Fire's song, September 21st. And how it is for the purpose of pointing to the solar flare, Earth, Wind, and Fire. In other words, the fire from the sun hitting the Earth on February 22nd, 2024. This date of this Comet E3 sign was the first visible day with the naked eye as well, by the way. But it just happens to be that on that day, its tail got disconnected. This was the news event because of solar winds. It's absolutely stunning how it all connects. November 18th, the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai date, was the launch of Artemis, the NASA mission to the moon, ! So the Earth, Wind, and Fire anniversary, the 44th year of it, the release of that song, is the 10 Commandments date, blasphemy, and that's the day the Artemis launched to the moon. So it all ties together again. The Draconids meteor showers have been signs in history pointing to the UN. That's the Draconids are in the constellation Draco. I guess that's why I added that note, that footnote there. But that's to be explained in another video. But it all connects because that's also Antichrist, the Draconids meteor shower. Okay, November 18th, 2022, 44 years after Earth, Wind, and Fire and Artemis. November 18th, 2022 was 4 plus 4 days after Artemis was hit by Hurricane Nicole. Wind. Okay. Highest wind speeds were recorded at Kennedy Space Center. So it just so happens that the hurricane landed 70 miles, I think it was south of Artemis, which got stuck on the launch pad because Hurricane Nicole was a surprise. They had already rolled out the Artemis space launch system. I think it was called the Orion. The Artemis was already rolled out, and that was a major prophetic sign on November 3rd. That was one of the super dates. Okay, I already mentioned it. The Plymouth Rock Jeremy Pena sign was on that date, but one of the other signs was the rollout of the Artemis launcher thing, right? And so, but the thing is that the highest winds were recorded right at Kennedy Space Center. In other words, the highest winds were hitting the Artemis spaceship on the launch pad, which was massive judgment symbolism. 70 miles too is symbolic too, because that's the number in the Bible that symbolizes judgment on the nation. The Second Temple of Israel was destroyed in 70 AD, and they were exiled to Babylon for 70 years, for example. So, now, the thing is, too, this is amazing. On the same day as Hurricane Nicole, there was this viral video of these two sharks that were swimming in the flooded streets of the town named Hutchinson Beach. This is so jaw-dropping because this is another of many prophetic signs in which God has clearly identified, beyond debate, what precisely is the Nicolaitan doctrine of our day. In Revelation chapter 2, Jesus said he hates the Nicolaitan doctrine and that he is coming to make war with the sword of his mouth on those that teach and have the works that are a product of this doctrine. You would think that there would be an equivalent Nicolaitan doctrine today because the letters that he wrote to the seven churches in Revelation chapter 2 and 3 aren't just about or for the seven churches. They are meant for the church in the end times, right? And so, most Christians will interpret that Nicolaitan doctrine, if they do think about it at all, as being some sort of vague symbolism for the wacky doctrine of some few churches, but not their church, their other church, right? And and largely not evangelical, that's for sure. That's the thing. Or if it is a supposed evangelical church, it's one of the wacky ones. They've got a errant pastor or something, an unusually eccentric teacher or something to that effect, right? That's what they think, if they think about it at all. But it is completely untrue. God is speaking to the vast majority of the evangelical church because, and this is proof, not only is what I'm about to say proof, but the prediction in this video is proof. And that's the purpose of the prediction. It's to prove exactly what I'm saying. That's the purpose of this prediction from God, that the dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan on May 4th, and that Kamala Harris will die in a plane crash on June 30th, for example. The purpose of it is to confirm that the Nicolaitan doctrine of our day that Jesus says he hates and is coming to make war on is what I am going to say. Now, the reason is because the reason for these two sharks in the viral video in Hurricane Nicole, as in Nicolaitan doctrine. Of course, Hurricane Nicole hints at Nicolaitan doctrine, right? So you would figure that there would be another sign involved in Hurricane Nicole that would identify what the Nicolaitan doctrine is. It only makes sense that that would be the case. And I didn't learn about this sign till months later. And I knew that the Nicolaitan doctrine was pointed to with Hurricane Nicole. But I didn't learn about this viral video until much later. And it's astounding. So in Hutchinson Beach, there was these two sharks swimming across the street while a car and some other cars are waiting to cross this flooded street because of Hurricane Nicole rolling in. And so two sharks are swimming in the street, and they're swimming into the city away from the beach. And one of the people in the background, as the guy is taking the video, was like laughing at the absurdity of the whole scenario here of sharks swimming in the street. But you can see the fins of the shark, right? Two sharks. And they're swimming in tandem. They're swimming together, side by side. One is slightly ahead of the other. And that's so clear symbolism for the two antichrists. And the second one getting his power from the first one. That's what's described in Revelation chapter 13, for example. There are two antichrists. And not only are they antichrists, but they're described using the metaphor of beasts. And what are sharks? They're beasts. So these two beast sharks are symbolism for the two antichrists. But not only that, this Revelation chapter 13, in which these two beasts, antichrists, are described, begins with the beast coming out of the sea. The first beast comes out of the sea. And so we have this metaphor of a beast coming out of the sea with these two sharks that are coming out of the sea in this Hurricane Nicole prophetic sign. And in the end times, what's the role of the antichrists? The primary function of the Antichrist is to persecute God's people, as I think I mentioned earlier. That's the purpose of the end times. It's to cleanse the church of, for example, its Nicolaitan doctrine. That's the whole point. The Nicolaitan doctrine is the reason why the end times are now and why the Antichrist. It's the root of the bad tree, the Nicolaitan doctrine. So what exactly is the Nicolaitan doctrine of our time? It's the Ann Hutchinson doctrine, which is why these two sharks swam across the street in Hutchinson Beach, in Hurricane Nicole, as in Nicolaitan. Well, who is Ann Hutchinson? Ann Hutchinson is the leader of the controversial free grace movement, the antinomian movement, at the spiritual founding of America. She was the divisive leader of this group that were following her that threatened the cohesiveness and the existence of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And just like free grace followers today are extremely divisive, extremely rhetorical, extremely ideological, they are extreme. They are just like Ann Hutchinson, personality, characteristic-wise, what I'm saying. The way they conduct themselves within the church, and the way they divide the church, the free grace people, okay, or otherwise known as the cheap grace people, or what's another way? Easy believism people. They see them. They don't see themselves as being such, of course, but of course they think that they're right, and they think that they are on the high ground, the moral high ground, and that they have the right doctrine. And furthermore, you have to have the intellectually correct doctrine in order to be saved. So that's why they are so vociferous with their doctrine, right? Which is the way that Satan would work through them, by being so outspoken and so divisive, right? But they're tricked, they're deceived, and so they're deceived, and they think that you need to believe intellectually the precise doctrine in order to be saved. That's also Calvinism too, by the way. You have to believe the correct thing in order to be saved, and saved past tense, right? You believe it one time, and then But if you go astray, then you weren't really saved. So they have the unnecessary paranoia about who was really saved and who isn't, right? Which was a problem in the early Calvinist days, and that's why even in the Puritans, they had in history, they because of all of this Calvinism and free grace, they developed a way to confirm whether someone was saved or not. And it had to do with the experience, the life-changing one-time experience at the moment you were saved, right? That evolved as a reaction out of necessity for this developing, evolving false doctrine that they were going down, this road that they were going down. But it led to free grace, which is antinomianism. And today, free grace, the Ann Hutchinson doctrine, is very, very widespread throughout the American church and the American evangelical church. But the cousin of antinomianism and free grace is sovereign grace. The two are the same. They both lead to the same heretical Gnostic doctrine of once saved, always saved. And the myth of imputed righteousness, and our righteousness is as filthy rags, etc. Like I explained earlier, I think. Make sure you watch the 23 church signs video on this channel. But anyway, this just proved, what God has done here just proved what precisely the Nicolaitan doctrine is. Okay? If for some reason you still refuse to see it, with the amazing two beasts on Hutchinson Beach during the Hurricane Nicole as a Nicolaitan, if you still refuse to see it, and also the tie-in to Boston, by the way, because this again all ties in to this what I'm talking about with the symbolism in Boston with the 400 years and all that, right? Because this was exactly 400 weeks after the eclipse, which was in turn exactly 400 years. This day of the Hurricane Nicole, right? This Artemis launch was 4 + 4 days after Hurricane Nicole. Okay, and Hurricane Nicole, by the way, was 7 days after the prophetic rolling out of the Artemis onto the launch pad. In other words, the hurricane hit 7 days. It hit Artemis on the launch pad exactly 7 days after the prophetic rollout of Artemis. And that's explained why it was prophetic, the rollout. But the 7 days hints at the 7 days warning given to Noah before the flood judgment. And what is Hurricane Nicole? It's a flood judgment sign. And so that's why the warning was the rollout, and 7 days later was the hit of the Artemis on the launch pad by Hurricane Nicole. More amazing confirmation, okay? So anyway, the point is that this all ties into Boston and the spiritual founding of Boston, because from the Pilgrim's Landing, again, 400 years to the eclipse in 2015 that marked an uncanny delineation between the old world and the new world, and I've explained that before. In turn, that is exactly 400 weeks to this launch of Artemis, which is moon symbolism in Christ, and eclipses for that matter are when the sun conjoins with the moon, right? Of course. And that was 4 + 4 days, which is prophetic because of the 44th president. And also, it was 44 years after Earth, Wind, and Fire released the song. So November 18th, 444 years, November 18th, 4 + 4 days after Artemis was hit by Hurricane Nicole. So in other words, it all ties together. In other words, what I'm saying is the Hutchinson Beach sign connects back to the founding of the Pilgrims. Case closed, right? 400 years, 400 weeks. It's absolutely astounding, right? Beyond words. And so in other words, this completely confirms what the precise Nicolaitan doctrine is. If you still don't see it because you really are, a Calvinist, sovereign grace, or free grace, well, the prediction in this video will prove it for you, okay? So let's move on. All right, this is huge. This is the point, actually. So it occurred to me that Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank hint at the mark of the Antichrist and how digital currency will be used to enforce the mark of the Antichrist. Silicon in Silicon Valley Bank, hints at microchips, digital currency, and Signature Bank hints at the mark. That's the mark. It's it's a thing, right? It's on a person. It's a mark. And that's what Signature hints at. All of the news stories highlight how these banks were the second and third biggest banks to go insolvent in American history. So all of the stories regarding these two banks, it was repeatedly mentioned how it was the second and third biggest banks in history. This second and third hints at 23. Again, I explained that just briefly a minute ago, how 2 and 3 hints at 23. And Mark, the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus said that the rooster would not crow twice before Peter would deny him 3 times, and the mark of the Antichrist, taking it, is tantamount to denying Jesus. That's why, 23. And that's what these two banks hint at, with the second and third biggest banks. 23 is the number of the GOAT Antichrist, the jersey of the basketball president who wore jersey 23, and hints at the mark, as I just explained, because of the 2 and 3 in the rooster not crowing twice and Peter denying Jesus 3 times, which changes the person's 23 chromosomes. And that's another reason why 23 is a number that symbolizes the mark of the Antichrist, because the thing changes the 23 chromosomes. On what dates did these banks fold? March 10th and March 12th. The day before and the day after the Boston Bruins sign and the Kennedy signs on March 11th, in which the score in the game was 2-3. So that's like 23,000 exclamation marks are appropriate for that. All right. So the game hinted at the number 23. Not only that, but it hinted at 2 and 3 because the final score was 2-3. And before and after were the two biggest banks, the day before and the day after. And it was the second and third biggest banks. God is so amazing and so creative with his signs. Again, March 11th is exactly 4 times 4 weeks before the predicted Harris's plane crash, near the center on the X of the map from the eclipses. Now, what do I mean? So the 2017 Great American Eclipse that traversed the country from coast to coast, the first eclipse to do so without touching another country since 1776. The year the nation was founded, not coincidentally. That eclipse, then the next Great American Eclipse, which will traverse from south to north, the path of totality of the eclipse in 2024 will cross over the path of totality of the 2017 eclipse exactly where it peaked, in the middle of the country, over an area of the country nicknamed Little Egypt, for that matter. And St. Louis is near that, and that's why Kamala Harris will crash there in St. Louis. It's because it will be pointing to the X on the map of the U.S., and this X is symbolism for the mark of the Antichrist. Because the X is symbolism for the Tav mark, which in Ezekiel chapter 9 would have been is the symbolic inverse of the mark of the Antichrist. Okay, and the X also hints at 23 chromosomes. If you can picture the shape of the 23 chromosomes, the chromosome is in the shape of an X. Okay, and that's also why the map on the X on the map hints at the mark of the Antichrist. It also, again, will the two eclipses go over Cairo, Illinois, for example. It's all over the area of the country nicknamed Little Egypt. Okay. And 4 times 4, 44 weeks, pairs with the, 44. 4 times 4 hints at the number 44, the 44th president. But 4 times 4 weeks pairs with the score 2 to 3 and the second and third biggest banks, which hints at the digital currency. Okay, so again, a crash of Harris, which will hint at the mark of the Antichrist, is exactly predicted to be exactly 4 times 4 weeks after this prophetic game in which the score was 2 to 3, which hints at 23. The 4 times 4 weeks hints at 44, and the game hints at 23. And exactly 4 times 4 weeks after the game that was 2 to 3, and the second and third biggest banks, is the day that it is predicted Kamala Harris's plane will crash in the area of the country that will symbolize the mark of the Antichrist. And this March 13th signs with the second and third biggest bank, and the score 2 to 3 hints at the mark of the Antichrist. So these two dates that will hint at the mark of the Antichrist because of the location that Kamala Harris will crash, and this prophetic game, which I just explained, hints at the mark of the Antichrist because of the two banks, the Silicon and Signature banks, and the number 23. They are separated by 4 times 4 weeks, which hints at the 44th president who wore jersey number 23. And God pairs 23 and 44 together to confirm the signs and connections and to reveal the identity of the Antichrist, who will enforce the mark of the Antichrist, which will be digital currency. The enforcement of the mark of the Antichrist, which will be through digital currency. You won't be able to buy or sell food unless you have taken the thing. And so again, Boston Bruins point to the Pilgrims crossing and the Antichrist after 400 years. So it all is about the Antichrist here. And so, what's more to be said here? I think I've explained this. I think you got this. This is amazing beyond words. In other words, the bigger picture point, if you will, of this March 11th sign involving these two banks, which hint at the mark of the Antichrist, is for pointing to the mark of the Antichrist. So revealing the mark of the Antichrist and the enforcement of it, which will be digital currency. Also, the 4 times 4 weeks from the Boston Bruins game and Kennedy signs to Harris's predicted crash hints at the flying goal, and Harris's crash is flying symbolism. So we have flight symbolism in the Boston Bruins here, as I've explained. And the Boston Bruins was all about, the flying goal was all about the number 4, as I explained. And so from this Boston game against the Red Wings, if you recall, it was the Detroit Red Wings, which is also flight symbolism, which I failed to mention in this email here. We have exactly 4 times 4 weeks to the crash of Kamala Harris's flight. It's absolutely astounding. So many levels that God is working on here with his signs. All right, there is way more to this, as I wrote here. This could be part of a new thread titled Amazing Signs on April 9th. Okay? So because the Boston Bruins story began in this email thread, I included this here, but it could have been another thread in itself because there's so much going on April 9th. So here we go. Get ready. This is just amazing. It was predicted that on April 9th, there would be a prophetic sign involving flight. Because of the signs and connections, it was assumed that this April 9th date would be the day of the crash of NASA's helicopter on Mars. God is pointing to this helicopter on Mars. It has already been used many times in his prophetic signs. Also, as explained in the helicopter videos, God uses helicopters in general as symbolism for the dragon, the helicopters and their tails. And Mars, the red planet, is symbolism for the Antichrist as well. So anyway, the point is that this was predicted ahead of time, and that's why there was expected to be flight symbolism on April 19th. Also, Strong's H82, the 82nd word in Strong's Hebrew Old Testament Concordance, is the word to fly. And April 9th, 2023 was 82 days after the Comet E3 sign, which I just explained, on January 17th. And which was the day that the tail was disconnected due to solar winds, on the day it first became visible to the naked eye and headed into the Draco, the dragon constellation. April 9th is also 82 days before it is predicted that Kamala Harris will die in a plane crash, another flight sign. The comet in the night sky hints at the high place and flight. And so that's why we have these two sets of 82 days connections that have the midpoint April 9th. Did we have a flight-themed prophetic sign on April 9th? Well, on April 9th, 2023, the Boston Bruins broke the record for most wins in a season at 63. Okay, as was explained earlier, God is using the Boston Bruins and their season and these various highlights and records achieved by the Boston Bruins in their season, and also, again, the last game of the season, which was explained in part 1 of this series. This was the day, April 9th, that they broke the record for most wins in a season at 63 wins. Arguably, out of the records broken, this would be the most significant, the most wins in a season. The other one we were discussing earlier was the quickest reach of 51 wins in a season in 64 games. But this is 63 wins. As explained earlier, the Bruins point to the flying goal and to the flying goal. On April 9th, they beat the Philadelphia Flyers. Okay, so when they broke this record, the Bruins hint at the flying goal. And on April 9th, when they made this all-time historic record of 63 wins in a season, they played the Philadelphia Flyers. In the sign on March 11th, they beat the Red Wings. That's the beginning part of this video, is how their record of 50 wins in a season, quickest reach of it, 50 wins, was against the Red Wings, which is also flight symbolism. And the theme here is the Boston Bruins flying goal, as I have been explaining. As explained earlier, the flying goal is about the number 4. And this hints at the number of 400 years since the Mayflower Crossing and Plymouth Rock. That's the whole reason for the Boston, Massachusetts Bay Colony, Boston Bruins, and the flying goal, and the 4, which hints at the 400 years, as I explained. Okay, April 9th is 4 days before the date it is predicted the dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan. Now, as we now know, the signs on April 13th were for the purpose of pointing 21 days later to May 4th. That was explained in part 1 of this video. But this was confirmation of the fact that God was pointing to April 13th. Among many, 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 many confirmations, it's hard to describe, including other signs with the number 4 in it on April 9th. And I don't think I mentioned it here, so let me try to remember offhand. This was the day of in Europe, the 2 busiest ports. The busiest port in Germany and the busiest port in France, Marseille, Hamburg, Germany, Marseille, France. in Hamburg, Germany. The explosion was at 4 a.m., if I recall. And that it was a toxic fire explosion. It was a cloud. It was a cloud of toxic smoke, symbolism hinting at toxic dirty bomb detonation and explosion. And in the Marseille, and that was the time is what gave us the number 4. And in the Marseille tragedy, 2 buildings collapsed, and there were 8 people in the rubble. 8 people divided by 2 buildings is 4. And more is to that. Okay, sorry, I needed to give you a second witness to the 4 days from April 9th to April 13th. And I didn't do that exhaustively. I didn't give you all of the evidence for it, but you get the idea. And that's, how God's science works. It works on the principle of second and third witnesses confirming matters. And that's what also makes it difficult to explain, because you just go onto rabbit trail after rabbit trail, because everything needs another witness to confirm it, which needs another witness to confirm it, and on into infinity. Okay, so anyway, April 9th was 4 days before April 13th. As we now know, was signs, and as was explained, signs that were about Massachusetts, including the other Boston game, the Boston Bruins game, and the arrest of the document leaker in Dayton, Massachusetts, and the other Boston baseball game on that day. Okay, so this was 4 days after the Boston Bruins broke the record for 63 wins in a game. 63 wins hints at the number 9. It's a multiple of 9, and 6 plus 3 equals 9. 9 is the most important number in God's big picture of signs, as from the Bible it symbolizes God's judgment. This was 29 days after the Bruins broke the record for quickest reach of 50 wins. 29 hints at 2 plus 9 equals 11. This 29 days from the 63 wins, which hints at 9, hints at 11, because 29 hints at 11, and 63 wins hints at 9. This gives us a pairing of 9 and 11. They won their 50th game on March 11th. 311 hints at the Church of Philadelphia. With their 63rd win, they beat Philadelphia in Philadelphia and scored their 131st point. Okay, so NHL ranks teams in terms of points. Okay, each win I think gets them 2 points, a tie 1 point, and a loss 0 points. Okay, so when they broke the record for 63 wins, that was the equivalent in their season of 131 points. And as was explained earlier, well, I wrote it here, so let's just go on. The NHL ranks teams according to points. 131 hints at Revelation 3:11, as well as it hints at G131, which I explained earlier is the word for blood disease in Strong's Concordance, as well as G113, wicked, lawless men, unprincipled men. The record for points in a season is 132, made by the Montreal Canadiens in the 1976-77 season. The Parti Québécois came to power in 1976, which led to the exodus from Montreal Island due to oppressive minority language laws. This is another astounding way in which God has tied this story that's leading to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, as I explained, to Montreal. Okay? Because again, the minority laws was expressed through the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment because of the pay of $13 that they didn't receive and instead were paid $10. Okay? The largest mass migration in North American history in the 20th century, which was the exodus from Montreal Island. They fled to Toronto and Mississauga. The 1979 Mississauga evacuation was due to the bomb train was the largest in North American history. As explained in the video, the Montreal Exodus paralleled the Exodus in the Bible. That's in the East Palestine video, which is a must-watch. The Mississauga bomb train, hopefully you watched that before this video, by the way. If I failed to mention that, I apologize. You really should watch the other video first, but because this story is unfolding. That would be learning about God's story the way it unfolded in his signs. And thus, the way I'm explaining it. The Mississauga bomb train evacuation is paralleled by the East Palestine bomb train and evacuation, which point to the predicted dirty bomb and Manhattan Island evacuation. It would therefore not surprise me if the Bruins break the record for points in a season in their final game of the season, which happens to be against Montreal. When is that game scheduled to be played? On April 13th, exclamation mark. The Montreal Canadiens scored 132 points in the 1976-77 season, the year of the Parti Québécois, which led to the exodus from Montreal, which is the theme of what is going on here, which is all pointing to the predicted dirty bomb in Manhattan Island and evacuation from Manhattan Island, and the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And this was known, this email here was written before April 13th, and in part one, I have already explained the prophetic significance of this final game of the season between the Boston Bruins and Montreal Canadiens. And yes, the Bruins won that game, as we now know, 5-4, which hinted at the date 5-4, if you recall. And they did end up scoring a record number of points for the season, although they did break the record with their win the following game after this game against the Flyers, which was against the team from Washington, D.C., the Washington Capitals, which was another prophetic game. That was on April 11th, which was another prophetic date that God was pointing to ahead of time, although ahead of time it was not known that the significance of that date would be a Boston Bruins game. The date April 11th was known since last December to be a major prophetic date on which there would be a major prophetic sign. And I think I might explain that later in this video, that game and the other signs on April 11th, but let's continue. So this 132 points in the prophetic year of the Parti Québécois and Montreal and all that, the Bruins, the Boston Bruins, broke the record for most wins on the date April 9th against Philadelphia, exactly 222 weeks after the double doink by the kicker for Chicago against Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Eagles football team. That's astounding, okay? Which hinted at the double doink presidency of the president from Chicago. Okay, so this is major, and I don't know if I even follow up with anything more to do with this, but it's so huge because, okay, the double doink is a 2 goalposts and 1 kick. So the playoff game, this was a playoff game, and it was extremely prophetic. It involved the prophetic quarterback from Philadelphia. But you know what? So many things. I shouldn't have even mentioned that. All I need to do right now is say that the double doink kick was about the kicker at the final seconds of the game having a chance to win the game with a field goal, but his kick hit one goalpost, ricocheted off it, and hit the other goalpost, and then bounced back into the end zone. The end zone symbolizes the end times. The 2 goalposts, the double doink is what it has been known now to be called, is hinting at the second presidency of the president from Chicago. That's why this game was in Chicago, and this kicker was involved in other prophetic doinks this same season, which I won't get into because that's dangerous, because that's a serious rabbit trail. So I'm going to refrain. But the point is that 222 weeks hints at all of this. Okay? It's exactly 222 weeks after that Philadelphia game to this Philadelphia game. Okay? Now, the double doink football, and why this is relevant too, is because the double doink football game is the game that famously inspired the St. Louis Blues and their Gloria victory anthem. Okay? Rising from last place at the time, the Blues would go on to defeat the Boston Bruins in the Stanley Cup, which was 49 years after the Blues and Bruins were in the other Stanley Cup with the Boston Bruins involving the flying goal, which ended with the flying goal. The Gloria shouting anthem carried the team all the way to the victory celebration under the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, where 500,000 fans shouted, as I explained. They shouted on Pentecost. The Hebrews shouted on Pentecost when the walls of security collapsed on Jericho. That's a simple reading from the Bible, by the way, and God's signs confirm that. In the Bible, judgment begins at the gates, symbolically judgment on the people, which is why the Blues fans shouted under the Gateway Arch. That was exactly 199 weeks before the Bruins' record 63rd win on April 9th, which hints at 49. Okay, so it all ties together. All right? So 199 symbolizes judgment. The Blues fans shouted exactly 23 weeks, which is almost exactly 44% of a year, or 4 times 40 days after the double doink in Philadelphia, which in turn was exactly 4 plus 4 weeks after the same kicker hit the goalpost 4 times in the same game. That was the rabbit hole I didn't want to go down. On November 11th, 2018. There is too much to type out regarding this. 4 goals and 4 posts in one game on 11/11, which hints at 4. And I just explained it in the most recent video, East Palestine Dam video. Okay, so watch that video for that explanation. This is a pairing of 23 and 44. Okay, so from the Chicago double doink game, it is exactly 4 plus 4 weeks after the 4 goalposts in one game. And it is 23 weeks exactly before they shouted, okay? The fans and the Blues players. That was 49 years after the other Stanley Cup involving the Bruins and St. Louis Blues, okay? Now, they shouted exactly 199 weeks before the Bruins broke the record on the date 4-9, which hints at 49. And we're talking about the 49 years connection between the 2 Stanley Cups between the Bruins and the Blues. All right, so there you go. But what's also important, what I wanted to say is that, going back to what it started all of this, was how this connects to the Blues, is because the Blues players were in a bar after their hockey game in order to watch the football playoff game. And in this small little bar in Philadelphia, they were, the DJ, because it was in Philadelphia, was after each time the Philadelphia Eagles would score, the DJ would play this song Gloria, and all the people in the bar would get up and shout and sing Gloria. So this is where it all got started. The whole inspiration, which ended up being extremely prophetic, this shouting song, as I just explained why, it began on the day of the double doink in Philadelphia. And so that's how it ties into the Blues. And so that's why it's relevant that, 23 weeks later is when the Blues shouted, and then that, 199 weeks was after they shouted was with the 63rd win of the Boston Bruins. So you get the idea. And 199 symbolizes judgment because 9 is the number that symbolizes God's judgment, but also 19 is 10 plus 9. And from the Bible, the number 10 symbolizes God's perfect order. And so 19 is God's perfect judgment. So anyway, let's move on. The Bruins scored the record 63rd win, and this hints at 63, which hints at 9, as explained. It's a multiple of 9, and 6 plus 3 equals 9. The number 38 hints at 3 plus 8 equals 11. This was 38 days after they became the fastest team to score 100 points in a season on March 2nd. Okay, so I already explained, so they're all connecting together here. Okay, we explained how the record win, which hints at 9, was 29 days after they scored the fastest reach of 50 wins, and 2 plus 9 equals 11. Well, this 9 game, the 63rd win, which hints at 9, was also 38 days after they became the fastest team to score 100 points in a season on March 2nd. So the 38 hints at 3 plus 8 equals 11, and so that's another pairing of 9 and 11, just like the other pairing of 9 and 11 to the 50th win, okay? This is a pairing of 9 and 11. With that win on March 2nd, 2023, they earned their 101st point. 101 hints at 11 also. And they earned their 101st point 38 days before they broke the record with 63 wins. 101 and 38 hints at 11, and 63 wins hints at 9. So there's your pairing of 9 and 11. They earned their 101st point against the Buffalo Sabres. Okay, the Bruins slaughtered the Sabres 7-1. The expansion of America westward is symbolized by the slaughter of the Buffalo. This was the Buffalo Sabres, and they slaughtered the Buffalo hockey team. Okay, and the slaughter of Buffalo is symbolism for the expansion of America westward. It's a big part of the history of the expansion. It's the slaughter of the buffalo. In the Bible, the number 42 appears in context of slaughter. I think I might have mentioned that before, but again, 42, there were 42 cities reserved for those that were seeking refuge for manslaughter. 42 descendants of King Ahab were slaughtered by the men of King Jehu at the pit. 42 boys were slaughtered by the bear. And also in the book of Revelation, the number 42 is associated with the Antichrist and slaughter. So, I just said that, what I wrote. Okay. So 42 days after the Bruins slaughtered Buffalo is the predicted slaughter in Manhattan on April 13th. Now, again, this is all confirmed. This, in other words, 42 days connection is true. It's valid. It's fact. It's reality. 413 wasn't quote unquote wrong. All right? Because as has been explained, the signs on that date confirmed the relevance of it. We had the explosion related signs. We had the 18,000 cows, for example. Oh, wow. Wow. You see what happens when you go over the information. So the reason why, if you recall in part 1, I began the video by talking about the explosion sign on April 13th, which was the news of the 18,000 cows that were burned because of the explosion at the farm in Texas. But now it's known why. It wasn't just any old explosion, 18,000 cows. What's that all about, right? Okay, it was definitely a national news story involving an explosion, which is good enough. But God works on many deeper levels, and there's a reason for 18,000 cows. It hints at the slaughter of the buffaloes. And no kidding, because the cowboys in Texas would bring them up to the railroad. That's the origin of the cowboy. And the railroad is where they slaughtered the buffalo, on the plains. So there you go. Wow. That's the reason for the 18,000 cows. And because it connects with 42 days to this game in which the Bruins slaughtered the buffalo. And the bigger picture reason for why God does all this is because he's demonstrating his hand on American history. And also he's pointing to a slaughter, which is, the upcoming events, and the slaughter from the Antichrist, from the mark of the Antichrist, which is pointed to through the events and signs on April 13th, including the pointing to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which is all about the mark of the Antichrist, as we have now demonstrated, right? That's why Buffalo were beaten by the Boston Bruins, because it is pointing to the 54th Regiment, Massachusetts Regiment, and that is all about the Antichrist, as has been explained, because of the $13, and number 13 is symbolism for the Antichrist, who will enforce the mark of the Antichrist oppressive minority laws, and there will be a genocide. That's what all of this is leading to. The political cult of the left is in the process of a genocide of their arch enemy, true Christians, which is what is described in Bible prophecy. Come to think of it. I'm being a little sarcastic there. I apologize. It's just a little overwhelming sometimes, even though I know what's going on. So the Bruins are bears. It was 42 bears that were slaughtered by the bear in 2 Kings. So on both ends, we've got the slaughter symbolism confirmed, because it was the Buffalo team that was slaughtered, and it was the Bruins are bears. And in the Bible, 42 boys were slaughtered by the bear in 2 Kings. And so that is more confirmation for adding 42 days. And what do we get? We get April 13th. Now, what happened on April 13th that confirms that? Well, again, it was the slaughter of the 18,000 cows. And 18 is 6 plus 6 plus 6. So that's Antichrist symbolism. But it's not just about simply confirming the slaughter of Buffalo. It's about the bigger picture. And the bigger picture that God is communicating through the history and prophetic signs is the upcoming slaughter of the political left on their archenemy, true conservatives and true Christians, through the Antichrist, through the mark of the Antichrist. It's crystal clear. I hope you get that. And this is all confirmed through the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, because that's all Antichrist symbolism. The dehumanizing pay of $10 instead of $13. And that's why the dirty bomb is going to explode on May. It will point to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. Okay, so let's continue here. On the day that the Bruins slaughtered Buffalo and earned their 101st point, and by the way, that confirms all of what I'm saying, right? Because 101st point hints at the Bill 101, which was the codification of the oppressive minority laws in Montreal that led to the Exodus, which God is pointing to through the evacuation of the bomb trains in Mississauga and East Palestine, which is all leading to the dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan, right? And and that's why, anyway, which will be on 5-4, which hints at the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And that's why Buffalo earned their 101st point on this day, okay? Now, on this day, they signed their star player, number 88, to an 8-year contract extension. Okay, so it just so happens that on the day that they scored their 101st point and became the fastest team ever to score 100 points, they signed an 8-year, I think that's an unheard of contract. It might be a record. I wouldn't be surprised, because God, again, uses records in his signs to confirm his signs. But that's an extraordinary amount of years to sign a player for. In any case, and it just happens to be 8 years, and it's for player 88. Again, the isopsophia for the name Jesus is 888. The numeric value of the name Jesus in Greek is 888. Okay, now this game was 9 months and 11 days after Washington player 8, the hockey player for the Washington Capitals, became the third player in history to score 800 goals, after Gordie Howe and Wayne Gretzky, players 9 and 99. 101 points for the Bruins on this day, which was 9 months and 11 days after the player 8 became the third player to score 800 goals, okay, which points to the other two, player 9 and player 99. This gives us a pairing of 9 and 11. Okay, 100 points pairs with 9 and 99, and they connect with 9 months and 11 days. It's astounding. Player 8 scored 3 goals at age 37, and the final score of that game was 7-2-3, making this a 3 sets of 7 game. On this day, that Washington player 8 scored 800 goals. The U.S. Department of Energy announced a breakthrough in nuclear fusion and confirmed that for the first time, again, God uses first times for his signs, scientists achieved a reaction that created more energy than was used. From this nuclear fusion sign, it is 9 months and 11 days to the record 101st point, which is in turn 42 days before it is predicted a nuclear dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan. So nuclear fusion technology sign to the predicted nuclear dirty bomb. But again, April 13th was a step in the trail of signs that leads to May 4th and the explosion of the dirty bomb. The location of the 9/11 events. The dirty bomb will be in Manhattan. So that's why 9 months and 11 days from the nuclear fusion sign to the nuclear dirty bomb in Manhattan, which was the location of the 9/11 events. The captain of the Washington Capitals hockey team scored his 3 goals and 800th goal in Chicago, from where the captain of the Antichrist system and future 48th president is from. The Bruins slaughtered Buffalo on the date 3-2, which hints at 32. 32 hints at 4 times 8 equals 32, which hints at the 48th president, who will be the Antichrist. 32 days before the date 3-2 was the day the mayor, Hurricane Hazel McCallion, died at the age of 101. Okay, so on the date 3-2, the Bruins scored their 101st point, or earned their 101st point, in the record prophetic sign, which is the fastest reach of 100 points, but they earned 101 points on the date 3-2, and 32 days before this date 3-2 was the day that the mayor of Mississauga died at the age of 101, which ultimately hints at the Bill 101, the French minority oppressive minority language laws. The East Palestine video explains the symbolic importance of this mayor. The oppressive minority language laws in Montreal that triggered the exodus to Montreal were codified in Bill 101. I forgot to mention that she died at 100. No, I mentioned it over here. Okay. The mayor of Mississauga at the time of the Mississauga mass evacuation went on to serve as mayor until 2014, and she died at the age of 101. Okay, and again, this is the day that the Bruins scored their 101st point. The Bruins broke the record for quickest reach to 100 points and earned their 101st point on the date 3-2, 32 days after the Mississauga mayor, McCallion, died at the age of 101. And her age pointed to Bill 101, which triggered the exodus from Montreal Island to Mississauga. And the residents that fled Montreal in Mississauga would have also then been part of the biggest evacuation due to the train bomb, the bomb train. The oppressive minority laws of Bill 101 hint at the coming oppressive minority laws in the Antichrist system led by the 48th president. 32 hints at 4 times 8 equals 32 and the 48th president. The prophetic state funeral for Mayor Hurricane Hazel McCallion on February 14th, 2023 was the same day as the toxic spill and evacuation on the I-10 highway in the 48th state. Joshua died at age 110 after the walls of security collapsed on Jericho, and on 9/11, 110 stories of the Twin Towers collapsed, and the I-10 highway hints at 110, which also hints at Bill 101. The day of this prophetic state funeral and toxic spill and evacuation on Highway I-10 in the 48th state, Arizona, is 4 times 4 days before the Bruins earned their 101st point. On this date 3-2, which hints at 3-2, which hints at 4 times 8 equals 48th president. Okay, so 4 times 4 days, though, in between these two dates, hints at the 44th president, who will serve a second presidency as the 48th president. The Bruins scored their 101st point in their slaughter of Buffalo 42 days before the predicted slaughter in Manhattan on April 13th. And this 42 days is also 1 month and 11 days, which hints at 101, the 101st point, and Bill 101. The reason for this connection to Manhattan involving the numbers that hints at 11 is because on 9/11, it was Flight 11 with a crew of 11 that flew into the Twin Towers that looked like a giant 11 in New York State, the 11th state to join the Union, in New York City, a name in which there are 11 letters, because Jesus coined the phrase the 11th hour, which in ancient Israel referred to the last hour of daylight before darkness, and in English is an idiom that means last chance. Time is running out, as in last chance for the nation to repent and to turn back to God. On the same day that the Boston Bruins broke the record for most wins in a season, golfer Phil Mickelson scored the lowest ever round at the Masters tournament in Augusta for a player over the age of 50 years old. This served to highlight the PGA Championship win, his PGA Championship win, at the age of 50 on the day of Pentecost, and Pentecost literally means 50th. The Feast of Pentecost is arrived at by adding 49 days and 50 days to the Feast of First Fruits. The date 4/9 hints at 49, and on 4/9 in 2023, Mickelson broke the record for lowest score by a golfer over the age of 50. It's a 49 and a 50. On 4/9, he scored 7 under par to place tied for second at 4 strokes back from the winner. So he tied 4 strokes back from the winner because of his record lowest score for a golfer over the age of 50 at the Masters. This day in which he tied with 4 strokes behind the winner was 4 days before it is predicted that the dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan, which will be exactly 444 months after Jack Nicklaus won 144,000 at the Masters in Augusta in the 50th Masters tournament. Okay. Now again, April 13th ended up being a step on the trail, as you now know. This was valid, though. God used this tie score of 4 back to hint at 4 days later. It was part of the signs on April 9th that included the number 4. I just explained the buildings in the busiest ports of Hamburg and Marseille, which, by the way, was for the purpose of pointing to the busy port of New York, right? And anyway, those signs were 4 days before April 13th because God was pointing to April 13th as the date for the predicted dirty bomb in Manhattan. It is true. It just ended up being he wasn't done with his trail, but he needs to do that. He needs to establish these dates, and the way he establishes the dates in the trail are therefore fact, therefore true. Now, if you're a skeptic, you're entitled to be so until the actual prediction, right? When the dirty bomb goes off in Manhattan, it will confirm everything that I'm saying about April 13th. Until then, you're entitled to be a skeptic if you really want to be, although in my opinion, it's irrational, but that's your choice. But once the prediction happens, there's no possibility to be a skeptic anymore. In other words, everything that I have been saying is proven to be true. And that's the purpose of this prediction from God. Okay? But anyway, and so let's move on. I just explained how God's big picture of science works. I think that's necessary. But that's the point. And so by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this later, but the tie of 4 strokes backs gives us 2 4s, which hints at the 44th president. Okay. But anyway, also April 13th, the first connection I discovered actually that caused me to look at April 13th was the realization that it was exactly 444 months, which is 37 years, which hints at 3 sets of 7. But 37 years is also 444 months after Jack Nicklaus won the 50th Masters tournament and won $144,000 in Augusta. Okay, so moving on. The Masters in Augusta hints at the Antichrist and hints at Caesar Augustus, who reigned after his uncle Julius Caesar, who was the emperor of Rome from 48 BC to 44 BC, which hints at the 44th president and future 48th president and Antichrist. So that's why Caesar Augustus was the emperor from 48 BC to 44 BC. It was for the purpose of pointing to Barack Obama, the president, the 44th president and 48th president. Augustus Caesar was born in 63 BC. And on the day that Mickelson scored the best ever round for a 50-year-old golfer at the Masters in Augusta was the day that the Bruins won a record 63 games. It's absolutely astounding, okay? So, Augustus, it's pointed to Augustus. This is why Obama was born in August. Caesar Augustus was born in 63 BC, which gives us the number 9, by the way, in judgment. But on this day that of this Masters in Augusta with this prophetic sign involving Mickelson, the Bruins scored the record 63 games. Okay. In the Bible, a goat is symbolic of the Antichrist. The greatest of all time of golf is Jack Nicklaus. Arguably, we now have 2, Tiger Woods as well, and God uses Tiger Woods in his signs as a goat symbolism, which is explained in other videos. And his name, Nicholas, hints at the Nicolaitan doctrine and works that Jesus said he hates and is coming to make war on with the sword of his mouth on those that teach and have the works that are a product of this doctrine. The evangelical church has a phobia when it comes to works, and they'll scream, "You can't earn your salvation," which is part of their heretical doctrine that prevents them from understanding the Bible. They have to skip and ignore many verses in the Bible, including all the things that Jesus said to do. I mean, there's more do's and don'ts in the New Testament, twice as many than there are in the Old Testament. But okay, it's quite unfortunate. The modern American church, which is doctrine that spreads around the world, of course, because it's from America, that has this horrible doctrine and has a phobia as a result regarding works. Anyway, this is another instance of God using Nick to warn the church of its Nicolaitan doctrine and works. By the way, I want to be clear that one does not, quote unquote, earn their salvation. This is correct. But for the Calvinists to respond with, "You can't earn your salvation" in regards to doing works is deception. Because, as James said, our faith without works is dead faith. And it isn't true that we don't need to do any work. We don't do a one-time prayer and are saved. That isn't what is meant. That isn't the meaning of we don't earn our salvation. Jesus paid the ransom. We are free to go, but we need to follow Christ, and we need to, for example, do the do's. We need to produce fruit, as Jesus said, otherwise we'd be thrown into the fire. And when he said that, he was addressing Christians. He was addressing his disciples. And my point here is that we don't earn our salvation isn't a correct phrase. It isn't theological. It isn't found anywhere in the Bible. So it is not correct to respond with, we don't earn our salvation. Make sure you watch the 23 church signs video on this channel. Okay, now the name Mickelson hints at Nicholas. However, God needed to have the name Mickelson to also hint at Michael Jackson. Okay, so Mickelson does hint at Nicholas. And again, these two signs are separated by exactly 444 months. So definitely Mickelson hints at Nicholas, right? But the reason why it's a play on that and why it's an M instead of an N is because, as I'm about to explain, God also needed the name Mickelson to hint at Michael Jackson, okay? Now, and so his name Mickelson instead of Nicholson, like I just said. Mickelson scored a record for someone over 50, 444 months after the GOAT Nicholas won the 50th Masters, and Mickelson won the PGA Championship at the age of 50 on Pentecost, which means 50th, exactly 4,000 days after Michael Jackson died at the age of 50. The 4,000 word in Strong's Greek New Testament Concordance is the word for 5,000, which hints at 50. And Jesus miraculously fed 5,000 people as they sat in groups of 50, as he told them to. Michael Jackson died after receiving an injection, and Michael Jackson died at the age of 50, and he's known for that, right? Everyone knows that's the big story about how he died. It's because of the thing that he got, okay? And Michael Jackson died at the age of 50, exactly 4,000 days, which means 5,000, before Mickelson, as in Michael Jackson, won the PGA Championship at the age of 50 on Pentecost, and Pentecost means 50th. Mickelson also won the PGA Championship exactly 82 weeks after the other GOAT of golf, Tiger Woods, tied Sam Snead's record of 82 PGA tournament wins. That's astounding. This prophetic sign involving Mickelson, when he won at the age of 50 on Pentecost, was exactly 82 weeks after Tiger Woods became the GOAT when he tied Sam Snead's record of 82 PGA tournament wins. In Western culture, the name Zozo is the name of a demon. Tiger Woods' record 82nd PGA tournament win was at the Zozo tournament in Japan. And by the way, Japan is symbolism for nuclear weapons, and so that's also why it has ties to all of it, what we're explaining here. The only PGA tournament held in Japan. There's one tournament in the calendar year, in the season, that's in Japan, and that's this Zozo tournament, okay, which Tiger Woods won in 2019, his 82nd tour win, and he didn't win any others. His shortly after that, I'm about to explain that actually. He got into a car accident, okay? So anyway, in Western culture, the name Zozo is the name of a demon, which gives us Antichrist symbolism. Tiger Woods' record 82nd PGA tournament win was at the Zozo tournament in Japan, the only PGA tournament held in Japan. This particular golf course in Japan is the only location in the world, so only tournament confirms the only golf course, only location in the world that a particular microbe is found. This microbe was discovered by a Japanese microbiologist who happens to like to golf. He collected a soil sample from the golf course when he was golfing one day. In partnership with an American scientist, they discovered the compound that is the active ingredient in ivermectin. The pair won the Nobel Prize for this wonder drug that has cured many viral diseases around the world over the last 40 years. They won the Nobel Prize for their discovery, essentially, of the compound, of the active ingredient, of ivermectin. Okay, you spell that out. A couple of days prior to Woods' 82nd win in Japan, the tournament had been delayed a day due to a typhoon, hurricane, that had flooded the golf course. So one of the days it was completely rained out because of a flood on the golf course due to a hurricane, which was Noah's flood judgment symbolism. The account of Noah's flood is in the book of Genesis in the Bible. This is why exactly 69 weeks after Tiger Woods tied the record for 82 wins in Japan, after the golf course was flooded, was the day that Tiger Woods crashed his Genesis SUV when it rolled over in Rolling Hills, California. Okay, the flood account is in the book of Genesis. The make of the car is Genesis. The most central prophecy in the Bible is the 70 weeks prophecy, which is made up of a period of 69 weeks, followed by the 70th week, and this 70th week is symbolic of the end times period of the Antichrist. In other words, the reason why Tiger Woods won his 82nd tournament exactly 82 weeks before Phil Mickelson won the PGA Championship at the age of 50 on Pentecost, which means 50, exactly 4,000 days after Michael Jackson died from an injection at the age of 50, is because it identified God's cure for COVID, which is ivermectin. This is the truth about ivermectin that has been suppressed by those that are working for Satan. The purpose of this prediction from God that is made in this video, that a dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan on May 4th, will prove this. The reason why Tiger Woods crashed his Genesis SUV, that is the purpose of this prediction. Make no mistake, you, if you don't know this, have been susceptible to the propaganda and the lies. The industry has captured the regulatory agencies, and that system puts out false science as well. And you aren't hearing about the true science, the studies that confirm what I just said, which could have prevented many, who knows how many thousands, millions of lives, because of the political cult of the left. And I'm sorry, but if you are in the political cult of the left, you are complicit. You aren't innocent. You are complicit to all of this. You are complicit in this mass murder of all of these people that could have taken ivermectin, but didn't because of the sky-high levels of corruption and false religion that is satanic, which is why God needs to destroy America and the Western countries that are deep in this mass hysteria. Because other countries, for example, on that note, God is going to judge the world, but the other countries in the world are using ivermectin and cured their COVID. And you didn't hear about that either because of the wicked, lying mainstream media that is also captured completely by the regulatory. It's all one big ball of corruption. Okay, all of the media is paid for. 70% of their income in a non-election year comes from the pharmaceutical industry, for that matter, right? All right, now, where was I? The purpose of this prediction from God that is made in this video, that a dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan on May 4th, will prove all of what I have just said. That's the purpose of this prediction from God. To miss that is to miss entirely the point of this prediction that is from God. You simply do not get it. There's no point of you even listening to this video. Okay? This isn't for entertainment. It's to prove the things that I am saying. That's why God has given me a voice through this prediction. It's to prove what I just said, which is what the cure for COVID is. That's the cure for it. Okay? It's also a prophylactic too. It prevents COVID as well. But if taken as soon as the symptoms, it's cured as well. Okay? Okay. So, where was I? Let's see. The reason why Tiger Woods crashed his Genesis SUV exactly 69 weeks after he became the GOAT of golf with 82 wins on a golf course that was flooded is because 69 weeks symbolizes the beginning of the end times period. Okay? Again, the most central prophecy in the Bible is the 70 weeks prophecy. The 70th week, which comes after the 69 weeks, is the symbolic of the end times period and the Antichrist. And the reason why Tiger Woods crashed his SUV 69 weeks exactly after he won in Japan is because exactly 690 days after Phil Mickelson won the PGA Championship on Pentecost at the age of 50, on May 23rd, 2021, it is exactly 690 days to the date it is predicted that a dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan. So I didn't say that quite well. So all of this, so 82 weeks exactly after Tiger Woods won his 82nd tournament was the day that Mickelson won at the age of 50 on Pentecost, 4,000 days after Michael Jackson died at the age of 50. That date that Mickelson won the PGA was a super date, if you will. Many signs, May 23rd, 2021. And that date is in turn 690 days, which hints at 69 weeks, to the date it is predicted that a dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan. So obviously that gets us to April 13th. And again, April 13th is completely valid. The 690 days is completely true because the signs on April 13th confirmed that it was a step in the trail that is leading to the predicted dirty bomb in Manhattan on May 4th, which will cause a mass evacuation of Manhattan Island. Noah and his family were evacuated from the flood judgment. The location of the golf course on which Phil Mickelson won the PGA Championship was on the coast of South Carolina, exactly where the path of totality of the Great American Eclipse exited the U.S. in 2017. That's why the location of this prophetic win of Phil Mickelson, it's pointing to the eclipse, which was the big judgment warning sign on America, which again is about the mark of the Antichrist because of the other eclipse that's going to cross over it, producing, engendering an X, which is symbolic of the mark of the Antichrist, as I explained. The upcoming eclipse in 2024 will be exactly 365 days or 1 year after Phil Mickelson scored the lowest ever round for someone over 50 years old at the Masters in Augusta. The 2024 eclipse will be on the date 4/8, which hints at the 48th president Antichrist. The path of totality of the eclipse in 2024 will cross the path of totality of the eclipse in 2017, exactly where it peaked, over an area of the country nicknamed Little Egypt. In the Bible, Pharaoh in Egypt is prophetic a prophetic type for the Antichrist. This will engender an X over the map of the nation and will symbolize the Tav mark. The Tav mark in the book of the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 9 is symbolic of the mark of the Antichrist, which is the thing that people take instead of taking IVERMECTIN, God's cure for COVID, right? People take the mark because they don't know about this cure, IVERMECTIN, which is why God moved his trail of signs through May 23rd, 2021, and this prophetic win of Phil Mickelson, which points to IVERMECTIN, as I explained, through Tiger Woods, but also the eclipse. And the eclipse, in turn, points to the mark. Okay? The reason why Mickelson tied for second with another player, making it two players that were 4 strokes back from the winner, is because this hints at 2 fours, which is symbolic of the number 44, which identifies the GOAT Antichrist, the 44th president. The reason for the recent controversy surrounding Phil Mickelson and his decision to play in and poor performance in the golf league in Saudi Arabia, the home of the spiritual enemy, is because, and there's multiple homes. I mean, it's one of the symbolic homes of the spiritual enemy, is because the name of the league is 54. The name LIV is not an acronym. It is the Roman numeral for 54. The number 54 is a multiple of 9, and 54 hints at 5 plus 4 equals 9. The number that symbolizes God's judgment. Oh my, wow. So when I wrote this, I didn't even realize at this time, because it was before April 13th, I didn't even realize that God was pointing upcoming to the date 5-4 and 54 and the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. So this is the first time I'm learning this, as I'm reading this, as I'm recording the video here. So this is yet another confirmation. So Phil Mickelson, a big part of the story of Phil Mickelson this year, and so the sign confirms the story, because Phil Mickelson is very much in the news of the golf world this year, okay? And then he comes back from the Saudi Golf League and plays in the Masters, and then has this record of lowest score for a golfer over the age of 50. And he ends up being 4 strokes behind the winner, tied with another person. Okay? Now, but the story about Phil Mickelson is his play and his performance. And the story is how badly he's been doing since he left the PGA, and how he's playing for this league that's named 54. Now, some people don't know that the league is named 54. But that's literally the name of the league, because And the LIV is not an acronym, it's the numeral for 54. And so in other words, God used this again to point to the date 5-4 and May 4th, the date we are looking for the dirty bomb explosion. Okay? And again, this Phil Mickelson sign on the date 4-9 coincides with the other dirty bomb explosion themed signs, symbolic signs, which again were the signs in Hamburg, Germany, and Marseille, France, which gave us the number 4, which pointed to April 13th, which in turn points to the date 5-4. So it all ties together. It's amazing. Okay, so I didn't know that Phil Mickelson ties to this with 54 here. The judgment destruction from God is not only on God's Gentile nation, though. It is on the West. 4/9/2023 was Resurrection Sunday, which commemorates when Jesus rose from the grave in the early morning. In the early morning in Marseille, the busiest port city of France, there was a huge explosion that caused the collapse of 2 buildings, trapping 8 people in the rubble. 8 people trapped in the rubble of 2 buildings hints at 8 divided by 2 equals 4. 4 days after this is it is predicted there will be a dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan, the location of the 9/11 judgment, warning in which 2 buildings collapsed. So there was 2 buildings that collapsed in Marseille, which hints at the 9/11 2 buildings collapsed. And the dirty bomb will be on Manhattan, the location of 9/11. And it was predicted to be on April 13th, and this 4 days is confirmed to be valid because the signs on April 13th in turn pointed to the date 5-4, May 4th. 8 divided by 2 is also 4 plus 4, which hints at 44 and the 44th president Antichrist. Also, on the same morning, the early morning, and that's what Resurrection Sunday is about, the early morning, a state of extreme danger was declared by authorities in Hamburg, the busiest port city of Germany. A possible toxic cloud of hazardous chemicals was moving to the city center after 2 warehouses caught fire at 4:40 a.m. 2 warehouses in Hamburg parallels the 2 buildings in Marseille. And this hints at 2 plus 2 equals 4, which hints at the dirty bomb explosion and toxic gas in Manhattan 4 days later. 4:40 a.m. also confirms adding 4 days and also hints at the 44th president Antichrist. Regarding this prophetic game, when the Bruins broke the record for most wins in a season, a noteworthy aspect of the game itself that the sports writers noted occurred in the first 64 seconds of the game. Okay? The Bruins are about the flying goal. All right, so now I'm going to break down the prophetic details and signs within this prophetic game with the Boston Bruins when they scored their record most number of wins in a season at 63 on the date 4-9. Okay, we're talking about the date 4-9 still here. These are amazing. Okay, so regarding this prophetic game when the Boston Bruins broke the record for most wins in a season, a noteworthy aspect of the game itself that the sports writers noted occurred in the first 64 seconds of the game. The Bruins are about the flying goal. They beat the Flyers. One would suspect that the Lord would connect this date to the rapture, when God's faithful will fly. It is exactly 59 weeks from the game on 4-9 to the rapture on April 26th, 2024. This is also 1 year, 1 month, and 17 days, which seems to hint at H 1117, a high place, which would seem to fit this flying theme. This inspired me to look at the game highlights and see if there is a clear and prophetic 59 or 17 in the game. 59 is the 17th prime number. Okay, so the Bruins are about the flying goal. We have this record 69 wins on 4/9/2023. Okay, and it is exactly 59 weeks to the rapture, and the rapture is the theme. It's symbolism, or flying is symbolism for it. It's a theme of it, flying. Okay, so it's quite feasible to, or reasonable to conclude that there possibly could be a 59 or 17 in the game. And the reason for 17 is because 59 is the 17th prime number. Okay? Sure enough, the noteworthy first 64 seconds reveals the 17 number, the number we're looking for. The noteworthy first goal that was scored with the first 64 seconds reveals the number 17. The first goal was scored by Bruins number 13 with 47 seconds elapsed in the game. The second goal of the game was scored by Flyers number 57 just 17 seconds later. 13 symbolizes the Antichrist, as I've explained. Player 13 and player 57 give us 70. 13 plus 57 equals 70. 70, like 7, the number 7, indicates God's signature number. His divine touch upon something is signified by the number 7. There are 7 continents, 7 notes in a musical scale, 7 colors in a rainbow, 7 levels in a periodic table of elements, 7 metals on which antiquity civilization is founded, 7 visible objects in the night sky that move. Okay, 7 planets, in other words, or so in the sun and the moon. 7. So anyway, so 7 on, and that's God's number. So the 70 in the player's numbers confirm the significance of the 17 seconds in between their goals. And you know what I forgot to mention is that 17 is the 7th prime number. Okay, so that's another confirmation right there. And anyway, the 2 goals 17 seconds apart confirms the exact 59 weeks from this game to the day that God's faithful will fly in the rapture. It makes sense that a flyer's goal would give us the sign. Given this connects to the rapture. As well, the Flyers play for Philadelphia. The Church of Philadelphia is the only church out of the 7 that Jesus said would be spared the hour of tribulation. So in other words, the 70 here hints at the 7 churches that Jesus wrote to, and that's why it's the team from Philadelphia. This is Revelation 3:11, which is why on 3/11, March 11th, the Bruins broke the record for quickest reach of 50 games, which was explained earlier. With this second goal, the score was tied at 1-1. The significance of this is confirmed by the Bruins goalie, player number 1, whose error led to the Flyers' goal. The 1-1 score hints at 11, and the 1-1 score came as a result of the goal that was 17 seconds after the first goal. This hints at 11 and 17, which confirms the 1 year, 1 month, and 17 days between this game and the rapture. Okay? Not only that, though, 11 and 17 hint at 9/11, because after Flight 11 with a crew of 11 people, hit the Twin Towers, it looked like a giant 11 in New York State, the 11th state. The second plane hit the second tower 17 minutes after. So 17 seconds hints at 17 minutes. And also on 9/11, the 2 flights, as in Flyers, were flights from Boston. Yeah. So the first 64 seconds of the game hints at 8 times 8, which hints at 888 and Jesus, whom the faithful will meet in the air when they fly at the rapture. It's absolutely amazing. The Flyers goalie is player 32, which hints at 4 times 8 and the 48th president. The first goal by player 13, which is the number that symbolizes the Antichrist, came at 47 seconds into the game. The Antichrist will replace the 47th president, which will be Michelle Obama. It's predicted to be the case on September 24th, actually. She will become the 47th president. Following the first 2 goals of the game, after the first 8 times 8 seconds, 64 seconds, Boston player 88 scored 2 goals. The second goal for player 88 was off of a direct pass from teammate player 59. The second goal for player 88 was also his 59th of the season. This is clear confirmation for adding 59 weeks exactly to the second coming of Jesus, whose name in Greek equals 888, which is hinted at with this player that scored 2 goals, player 88, the 2 goals that followed the other 2 goals that were scored after 8 times 8 seconds. And this game is exactly 59 weeks before the rapture. And player 88 scored his second goal from a pass from player 59, and it was his 59th of the season. That's astounding confirmation. That's crystal clear that the rapture is exactly 59 weeks. Because again, this is against Philadelphia, the only church out of the 7 that is said to be raptured, and against the Flyers, which is flying rapture symbolism. And we are talking about the Boston Bruins and their connection to the flying goal. This second and third goal for the Bruins hints at 2 and 3. Player 88 scored the next goal for the Bruins as well, making it a hat trick, which is the term in hockey when a player scores 3 goals in a game. 3 goals, again, off a pass from player 59. 59 is the 17th prime number, and 17 is the 7th prime number. This seems that the 3 goals could be symbolism for 3 sets of 7. The Hebrews took the promised land after 3 sets of 7. Regardless, though, he scored the next goal again off a player with a pass from 59. So more confirmation there. His third goal was in the third period, and it was his 300th goal of his career. A hat trick for his 300th goal. Okay, what are the odds of that? It's very rare, very, very rare for a player to score 3 goals in a game. It's so rare they've given it a name. It's called a hat trick. It's a big celebration when it happens. But it just so and a hat trick means 3 goals. And it just so happens that he scored this third goal in the third period for his 300th goal of his career. And we are talking about a prophetic game. This record number of wins for the Boston Bruins. And it being a confirmation for an exact 59 weeks later to the rapture. Okay, and the 3 sets of 7 would hint at that because the Hebrews took the promised land, which was symbolism for God's people going to heaven, the kingdom. And they took the promised land after 3 sets of 7, right? As I've explained many times. And so this is real. In other words, this 3 sets of 7 we are perceiving here. His third goal made the score 4-2, which hints at the Antichrist, because 42 is the number that symbolizes the Antichrist in the book of Revelation. The final goal of the game was a goal by the Bruins that made the score, a final score, add up to 8. And player 88 had the assist, which again hints at 888 and Jesus. Player 18 scored the final goal. 18 hints at 6 + 6 + 6. This final goal of this very prophetic game, 63rd win, which gives us the number 9 from 63, and on and on. As I've already explained. The other signs on this same date, including the 3 signs. Mickelson tied 4 back with the other player, 4 back, 44 the president. The 4s in the Marseille and Hamburg signs, okay? 44 the president, 4:40 a.m., remember? Also, the final score of this game was 5-3, which hints at 53. And 4 days later, which is very relevant for adding 4 days because of the signs I just mentioned, gets us to April 13th and the 53rd anniversary of Apollo 13. The extremely prophetic anniversary, and the relevance of this is explained in other videos or elsewhere, maybe in part 1, I forget, or maybe other videos. But again, we are talking about the number 13 in context of these signs that are pointing to the $13 of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment story. Anyway, we get the 53rd anniversary of Apollo 13, which is very prophetic, the Apollo 13 disaster, that is, which was due to an explosion. And also 53 is the 16th prime number, which hints at 4 times 4 and the 44th Antichrist. And 13, for that matter, symbolizes the Antichrist, and Apollo 13, for that matter, and on and on. Returning to the reason why this game is important. It was their record 63rd win. 63 hints at 9. It is a multiple of 9, and 6 plus 3 equals 9. As well, it is 7 sets of 9 that equals 63. The players that scored the first 2 goals add up to 70, which hints at 7. And the 7 churches, which is why it was in Philadelphia. But more importantly, God pairs 9 and 17 together. The first 2 goals of this 63rd win, which hints at 9, were 17 seconds apart. And so that's a pairing of 9 and 17. As well, 63rd win, which hints at 9, is exactly 59 weeks, which is the 17th prime number, to the day that the faithful will fly in the rapture. So that would also be a pairing of 9 and 17, because the 63rd win hints at 9, and then 59 weeks later hints at the number 17 because it's the 17th prime number. Also, the third goal for player 88, which was also his 300th goal, hints at 3 times 3 equals 9, which is hinted at with the 63rd win. And again, 9 equals judgment. Boston equals America. Judgment on America, the spiritual founding of America. Okay, there was a prophetic plane flight on March 11th. And again, as I was saying earlier, March 11th is exactly 4 times 4 weeks before the date it is predicted that Kamala Harris will die in a plane crash. And which is also 111 days, but I explained the relevance of that before, But anyway, 4 times 4 weeks is easy to remember because it hints at 44 and the 44th president. And here's the link to that prophetic sign. The pilot was incapacitated, had to be taken to the hospital. We all know why. It was for having taken the thing, which is plaguing the industry. They have a shortage of pilots because of this. The pilots are especially affected by the thing because of the altitude that they fly at. So their hearts are especially susceptible to the damage from the thing. And anyway, this isn't the only industry, of course, that's experiencing a worker shortage now because of the thing. And anyway, this was an emergency landing because of this incapacitation of the pilot. The destination of the flight was to Chicago, the home of the Antichrist, who will enforce the thing, the mark of the Antichrist. And it had to make an emergency landing in Houston, which is Harris County. Astounding. Because we're talking about exactly 4 times 4 weeks later, the death of Kamala Harris in a plane crash. This is a big sign. There are many, many airplane aviation signs. This is an important one because it's so clear we are talking, because this one in particular identifies the mark of the Antichrist. That's why. And it points to Kamala Harris because of Harris County. It's all become clear now, and it is so amazing. The reason for the Boston Bruins game of 2-3, the score of 2-3 on March 11th, in conjunction with the Kennedy signs, Massachusetts. Again, the mansion, Jacqueline Mansion and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announcing running for president. That occurred in between the collapse of the second and third biggest banks, again giving us 2 and 3, on March 10th and March 12th, is because this date, this game, in which the final score was 2-3, was 54 days to the date 5-4, and the event that will trigger the collapse of the financial markets, the dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan. The big story regarding these bank collapses was how the Fed bailed them out. And would the Fed bail out all banks in the future? The answer is yes. And then they will implement their digital currency, which is why it was Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, symbolism for the mark of the Antichrist and digital currency. Okay, so this was like the climax. I hope you appreciated that, because we started this second half of this video with this game between the Bruins and the Red Wings when they reached 50 wins at a record time, and the final score was 2-3, and it was in between the two biggest banks, second and third, which ends at 2-3. And this game, okay, and this is all about the mark of the Antichrist because, Signature and Silicon Valley hint at that, and digital currency. This game is 54 days before the date 5-4, and it's Massachusetts, and it's all leading to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which is why 5-4. That's also confirmed here. It's Boston, the team, Massachusetts. Okay, and so it's leading to the date of the predicted dirty bomb, which will be the trigger that bursts the bubble of the financial markets and finally causes the biggest collapse in all of history, which will lead to the implementation in a crisis of the digital currency, which will be used to enforce the mark of the Antichrist. The reason for the number 13 in the signs on the 13th of the month of April, on the date that hinted at Nissan 13, and the Massachusetts signs, and why the signs pointed to the date 5-4, is because it pointed to the 54th Massachusetts that refused their unequal pay and not receiving their owed $13 a month. It was oppressive minority laws symbolism. Prior to the signs on April 13th, all of these signs were interesting, but they didn't all come together like they do now. So this was written after April 13th. Now I'm finally getting more of the clearer picture of what God has been doing here after April 13th. And like we now know, God was pointing to the date 5-4 all along here, but it went through April 13th because it's all pointing to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which is why the Massachusetts signs and the number 13, as I've explained a few times now, okay? But this all ties together with this prophetic Boston Bruins game because it's 54 days before the date 5-4, and it's all about the mark of the Antichrist and digital currency, which will be implemented after the dirty bomb because of the collapse of the financial markets. I previously decided to put the 4-9 sign in this thread, thinking that it belonged with the other Bruins signs on March 11th. I should have made a separate 4-9 thread. I've spent the last over an hour probably explaining the signs on 4-9, but anyway, yeah, they all tie together, right? It was just stumbled upon the date of the Mars helicopter crash. 4-9, the Boston Bruins Flyers game hinted at flying goal, which hinted at flight, and therefore the flight on Mars with the helicopter. And as I explained before, I was predicting that 4-9 would be the day of the crash of the helicopter. And the flying goal with Boston symbolism, and the number 4. 4 days after this Bruins Flyers game was April 13th, the date of more Massachusetts signs. For 13th was the 53rd, which is the 16th prime number, which is 4 times 4, anniversary of Apollo 13, which launched at Kennedy Space Center exactly 13 minutes after the hour. Kennedy, along with his family, is known for being associated with Massachusetts. The prophetic Boston Bruins Philadelphia Flyers game was 5-3 and hinted at the number 4 because of the flying goal association. 4 days later was the 53rd of Apollo 13 on April 13th. Okay, you follow that? The final score of this prophetic game on 4-9 was 5-3, and all of the signs on 4-9, as I've explained, hinted at adding 4 days to get the 53rd, which is what 5-3 hints at, anniversary of Apollo 13. And Apollo 13 is all connected to this too, because it's all about the $13 that the 54th Massachusetts Regiment refused as their pay. This is confirmed with the many other profound connections. Here's one. So 53 days after the 53rd of Apollo 13 is the predicted date that Mars's helicopter will crash on June 5th, 2023. You heard it here first. This is confirmed with many other profound connections. Here's one. 314 days after the flooding at the Gateway Arch in the city that has the area code 314, St. Louis, which was the day of the Navy Sea Dragon helicopter sign. So I'll be explaining more of this in other videos. The 50th flight of the helicopter on April 13th, another prophetic sign on April 13th, it was the 50th helicopter flight, was exactly 50 months after the official lost opportunity. NASA's probe on Mars Opportunity was officially declared lost, which hinted at a lost opportunity for America to repent, because Opportunity was launched 666 days after 9/11. And 9/11 was the big warning to repent. But that opportunity to repent was symbolically lost with the lost opportunity on February 13th, 19. And exactly 50 months later is April 13th, the 50th flight of the Mars helicopter. Okay? Will the Mars helicopter crash on its 53rd or 54th flight, hinting at, 53rd of anniversary of Apollo 13, or 54th flight, or 54th Massachusetts Regiment, or the 55th flight? June 5th will be 25 days, which is 5 times 5 days before it is predicted that Kamala Harris will die in a plane crash, and Barack Obama will replace her through the use of the 25th Amendment. And her crash will be in St. Louis near the I-55 highway. I'm thinking it will be the 55th flight. The predicted explosion and evacuation on May 4th, 5-4, which hints at 9, is also exactly 41 weeks after the Orange Line train burst into flames and evacuation from the bridge in Boston. This is astounding, and I'm going to put this in part 1 of the video because we were talking about this very sign in part 1. But 41 is the 13th prime number, 13 exclamation marks, $13 pay for the 54 Massachusetts Regiment. Massachusetts, 41 weeks to 5-4, which hints at the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. Okay, so the evacuation from the flames of the train, which hints at bomb train as well, by the way, which hints at the dirty bomb, because God was using the bomb trains to point to the dirty bomb. But anyway, this prophetic sign, which I explained before in the part 1, is exactly 41 weeks. It's astounding because 41 is the 13th prime number, and Massachusetts is all about the 54th Regiment and the number 13. And that's why 41 weeks later gets us exactly to 54. So this Massachusetts sign is connecting with 13, the number 13, to 5-4, which hints at the 54th Regiment and the $13 pay. How can I say it anymore? It's so amazing. It's also a pairing of 9 and 13, by the way, which God does to confirm his signs and connections. This is the end of part 2. I hope that you have made it this far. If you have, part 3 will be about the prophetic signs that occurred on May 4th. All of this, as you know, has been leading to May 4th. And so therefore, it is worthwhile to know what happened on May 4th. And it is astounding beyond words. And it is extremely important, as we would expect it to be, given what God has done to point to May 4th. The signs that occurred on May 4th will, I'm pretty sure, will only be explained in part 3 of this 54th Massachusetts Regiment video series. And so that's why I say hopefully you've made it this far, because if you haven't, then you won't know to go to part 3 to listen to and learn about the signs that occurred on May 4th, which are extremely important. I don't know how else to get that across with another video and title. I've promoted the 54th Massachusetts videos enough, so hopefully people have taken my word for it and given the benefit of the doubt and come this far and know that you need to watch part 3. Aliens and UFOs are demons masquerading as aliens and UFOs. Most people's spiritual experiences are demonic deception, especially if they are not a true follower of Christ. God became a man and died a horrible death at the hand of the ruler of this world, Satan, and then defeated death for you, so that you too can overcome death, which is the price that must be paid for sin. It is time to repent, which means to change one's ways and turn to God and become a disciple of Jesus. Please leave a like and upvote the video. And once this prediction has come to pass, share this video with everyone you know and more. Don't stop sharing it everywhere in social media. It is essential that everyone immediately read the homepage of my website, TrumpPrediction.com. If you are watching this on the YouTube platform, please note that not all of the videos are on YouTube. You need to switch to the BitChute.com or the Odyssey.com channel. And do it now in case you aren't able to later.